The story of the most dangerous queen the Plantagenet dynasty ever produced does not begin in a throne room or on a battlefield, though she would come to dominate both with a ferocity that her contemporaries struggled to name and her descendants struggled to forget. It begins instead in the court of her father, in the southernmost regions of what the medieval world considered the most cultured kingdom in Christendom, where the granddaughter of a crusader and the daughter of a duke absorbed, from the earliest years of her formation, the understanding that power was not a gift bestowed upon the deserving, but a territory to be seized, defended, and expanded through every instrument available to a mind determined enough to wield them all simultaneously. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Phone face down, volume at a whisper. Let's dive in. The world into which Eleanor of Aquitaine was born, sometime in the early 1120s, with 1122, the most commonly accepted approximation in the scholarly literature, was one already saturated with the complex legacies of conquest, religious reform, and the slow consolidation of feudal authority that characterized the Western European political landscape of the high medieval period. The Duchy of Aquitaine, over which her father, William X, presided, was among the largest and most autonomous of the great territorial lordships that constituted the patchwork of political authority in France. A duchy that owed nominal allegiance to the French crown, but that had historically operated with a degree of practical independence that made the word allegiance something closer to a polite diplomatic fiction than an accurate description of actual political relationships. The duchy encompassed an enormous sweep of southwestern France, reaching from the Loire River in the north to the Pyrenees in the south, and from the Garonne Valley in the east to the Atlantic coast in the west. A territory whose geographic diversity was matched by its cultural complexity, encompassing the wine-producing regions of the Bordelais, the pastoral uplands of the Auvergne, the maritime communities of the Gascon coast, and the agricultural plains of Poitou that had been the heartland of ducal authority since the Carolingian period. The economic foundation of this territorial wealth rested on the agricultural productivity of the river valleys, on the commercial activity of the port of Bordeaux, which had been developing as a centre of the wine trade since Roman times, on the tolls and market fees collected across an extensive network of commercial routes, and on the judicial revenues that accompanied the exercise of high justice over a population numbering several 100,000 individuals whose daily lives were governed by the complex interplay of ducal, ecclesiastical, and local lordly authority that the feudal system generated wherever it operated in its mature form. The management of these revenues and the governance of these populations required an administrative apparatus of considerable sophistication by 12th century standards, one that Eleanor's father and grandfather had developed through generations of ducal governance, and that provided Eleanor, during her formative years at the ducal court at Poitiers, with an education in the practical mechanisms of governance that no formal curriculum could have provided as effectively as the daily experience of observing how a great lord managed the complex political relationships that territorial authority required. The troubadour poetry that had developed in Aquitaine and the neighbouring county of Toulouse across the preceding century had given the southern court culture a character that distinguished it sharply from the more austere environment of the northern Capetian monarchy at Paris, and this distinction was not merely aesthetic in its significance, but carried within it a different understanding of the relationship between secular and religious authority, between personal sentiment and political obligation, and between the rights of individual lords and the prerogatives of kings that would prove consistently influential in shaping Eleanor's political instincts throughout the 6 decades of her extraordinarily active career. Eleanor's grandfather, William IX of Aquitaine, had been not merely a patron of troubadour poetry, but its earliest surviving practitioner in the Occitan vernacular, composing verse that combined the elaborate formal conventions of the emerging courtly tradition with a directness of personal expression and a willingness to engage with the emotional dimensions of human experience that gave his poetry a character unlike anything being produced in the more formal Latin genres of the period. This inheritance, cultural, aesthetic, and political simultaneously, was the most important formative influence on the woman who would become the most politically consequential queen of the 12th century Latin West, and its effects were visible in every dimension of Eleanor's subsequent career, from the literary patronage she provided at her courts to the political strategies she deployed in her conflicts with the kings who were her husbands, and from the cultural values she transmitted to her children to the diplomatic methods she employed in the management of the dynastic alliances that occupied the final decades of her extraordinarily long life. The death of William, 10th on the 9th of April in 1137, occurring during a pilgrimage to the great shrine of the Apostle James at Santiago de Compostela in the Kingdom of Galicia, transformed the political situation of his daughter and heir with an abruptness that the political world of the 12th century was structured to exploit with maximum speed. Eleanor was, at the moment of her father's death, an unmarried heiress of enormous territorial wealth, without a male guardian capable of providing the military protection that the feudal system required of territorial lords, and her vulnerability in this condition was immediately apparent to every lord in the surrounding region, whose military capacity gave him reason to contemplate the acquisition of Aquitaine through the feudal law of marriage, by which a lord who married a great heiress acquired authority over her territories and her vassals. The danger was not abstract. The preceding century had provided numerous examples of great heiresses being captured and compelled to marry their captors under circumstances that the law of the period found difficult to condemn when the captor was sufficiently powerful to enforce his claim and sufficiently connected to find ecclesiastical authorities willing to validate the resulting union. William, whose pilgrimage to Santiago was itself a political as well as a devotional act, had taken what precautions his circumstances permitted before departing, placing Eleanor under the formal guardianship of King Louis VI of France, a decision that invoked the theoretical suzerainty of the Capetian crown over Aquitaine to activate the practical protection that French royal authority could provide against the predatory intentions of regional lords, while simultaneously ensuring that the decision about Eleanor's marriage would be made by the most powerful secular authority in France, rather than by the chaotic competition of regional ambition. Louis VI, known to contemporaries as Louis the Fat, a designation that referred to the obesity that had made it impossible for him to mount a horse in the final years of his reign, and that had made him increasingly dependent on his son and heir for active governance, recognized in William's death the most significant political opportunity of his reign. The marriage of his son and heir to the Duchess of Aquitaine would unite the royal domain with the vast territories of the south in a way that could transform the balance of power within France from a situation in which the Capetian monarchy was merely the theoretical suzerain of territorial lords who were frequently stronger than it, to one in which the crown commanded resources sufficient to impose its authority with genuine effectiveness. The speed with which Louis organized the response to William's death testified to this recognition. Within weeks, he had dispatched Prince Louis southward to Bordeaux with an escort of 500 knights, a force sufficient to deter the immediate competitors for Eleanor's hand without being so overwhelming as to appear as an invasion of the territory whose lord's eventual cooperation would be necessary for the success of the entire enterprise. Prince Louis, who would become Louis VII of France, was a young man whose character had been shaped by an education intended for a monastic career rather than for kingship. Since the death of his elder brother had been unforeseen and had forced a sudden reorientation of a personality already formed in the direction of theological reflection, piety, and the kind of inward-looking devotional life that the Cistercian tradition of the period modelled as the highest expression of Christian virtue. This background generated in Louis a combination of genuine personal piety, a capacity for theological engagement that went beyond the conventional religious observance of secular rulers, and a fundamental uncertainty in the exercise of political authority that contrasted dramatically with the confident political intelligence of the woman he was travelling to marry. The marriage ceremony that joined Eleanor of Aquitaine and the future Louis VII of France was celebrated in the Cathedral of Saint-André in Bordeaux on the 25th of July in 1137, in circumstances that combined the formal magnificence appropriate to a union of such political significance with the urgency that Louis VI's instructions had impressed upon his son and his escort. 8 days after the ceremony, Louis the Fat died at Paris, and Eleanor found herself not merely the Duchess of the largest territorial lordship in France, but the Queen Consort of the French kingdom itself, elevated from the position of the most important heiress in the Western world to the highest formal rank available to any woman within the existing political hierarchy, a transformation accomplished in a matter of weeks that left both Eleanor and the court she had joined scrambling to adjust to the implications of a political situation that none of the parties involved had quite anticipated in the precise form it had assumed. The first decade of Eleanor's marriage to Louis VII established with increasing clarity the pattern of tensions and incompatibilities that would eventually destroy it. Though the process of destruction required 15 years, and the intervention of a crusade, a public scandal, and the deployment of canonical legal mechanisms before the formal dissolution could be accomplished, the incompatibility between Eleanor and Louis was recognized by contemporaries and has been analyzed by historians across multiple generations as rooted in a fundamental mismatch between their respective understandings of what queenship meant and what marriage between a king and a great heiress required of both parties. Louis, trained for the monastic life and elevated to kingship by the accident of his elder brother's death, brought to his position as king and as husband a set of values and expectations shaped by the Cistercian tradition of personal humility, devotional intensity, and spiritual interiority that sat awkwardly alongside the demands of active secular governance and was entirely incompatible with Eleanor's expectation that her position as Duchess of Aquitaine gave her the right and the obligation to exercise genuine administrative authority over her ancestral territories, rather than delegating that authority to Capetian officials whose primary loyalty was to the French crown rather than to the duchy. The specific disputes that animated the early years of the marriage are recorded with varying degrees of reliability in the surviving chronicles, but the general pattern that emerges from these accounts is one of persistent friction over the governance of Aquitaine, the management of Eleanor's relationships with her southern vassals, and the degree to which Eleanor's political preferences could legitimately influence decisions that Louis and his advisors considered properly within the royal prerogative. The northern French aristocracy that constituted the inner circle of the Capetian court found Eleanor's manner simultaneously exotic and threatening, perceiving in her cultural confidence and her political assertiveness the values of a southern tradition that did not accommodate the patterns of female deference and domestic self-effacement that Capetian queenship conventionally required. Eleanor, formed by the more generous understanding of female political capacity that the Poiters tradition offered, found the Capetian court austere and politically frustrating in ways that she did not invariably trouble to conceal from those around her, a transparency of feeling that itself constituted a violation of the courtly conventions of her new environment, and that generated the reputation for haughtiness and willfulness that the hostile chronicles would develop across the subsequent decades into a sustained portrait of wifely disobedience. The failure of the marriage to produce a male heir during its first 11 years was its most damaging single feature in strictly political terms, since the production of a son who could inherit both the French crown and the Aquitanian duchy was the primary reproductive obligation of the union, and the one whose fulfillment would have provided the most effective political foundation for its continuation regardless of whatever personal incompatibilities existed between the spouses. A daughter, Marie, was born in 1145 after 8 years of marriage, a delay that contemporaries attributed to various causes and that generated increasing political pressure on both parties, as the absence of a son became an increasingly visible political liability. The birth of Marie did not resolve the underlying tensions of the marriage. It merely provided a temporary relief from one of its most acute political problems, while leaving intact the structural incompatibilities that made the relationship increasingly difficult to sustain within the conventional framework of 12th century queenship. The deterioration of the relationship continued through the mid-1140s, shaped by the accumulation of specific disputes and disappointments, and by the growing recognition on both sides that the marriage had failed to produce either the political harmony or the personal compatibility that had initially seemed achievable given the enormous political advantages that both parties had brought to it. The decision by Louis to participate in the Second Crusade, proclaimed by Pope Eugenius III in December of 1145 following the fall of the Crusader county of Edessa to the forces of Zengi, provided the external event that would transform manageable marital tensions into the public crisis that eventually made the marriage's dissolution unavoidable, though neither party could have anticipated this outcome at the moment of the Crusade's proclamation. The preaching campaign conducted by Bernard of Clairvaux in the spring of 1146, culminating in the Great Assembly at Vézelay, where Louis publicly took the cross, generated the organizational momentum for an enterprise that would engage the combined military resources of France and the German Empire in one of the most ambitious military undertakings the Western Latin world had yet attempted, and that would expose with remorseless clarity the degree to which the personal and political relationship between the King and Queen of France had deteriorated beyond the possibility of repair. Eleanor's decision to accompany Louis on the Second Crusade has been interpreted across 8 centuries of historical commentary in ways that range from the sympathetic to the hostile, and that reflect, in their variety, the persistent difficulty of recovering the actual motivations of historical actors from the interpretive frameworks that subsequent commentary imposes on them. The most common popular interpretation, which attributes Eleanor's decision to a combination of romantic adventurism and a desire to escape the constraints of the Capetian court, fails to engage with the political logic of her position as Duchess of Aquitaine, whose southern French vassals constituted a significant portion of the crusading army being assembled, and whose effective mobilization required Eleanor's personal participation in the enterprise in a way that no deputy could replicate. The crusading army that assembled at Metz in the summer of 1147 was one of the largest military concentrations in the 12th century Western world, drawing contingents from France, the German Empire, Flanders, England, and numerous other regions of the Latin West, and accompanied by the enormous logistical apparatus of servants, suppliers, craftsmen, camp followers, and dependents that medieval armies of this scale invariably attracted, swelling the total number of people associated with the expedition to figures that contemporary accounts estimated in the hundreds of thousands, numbers that modern historical analysis reduces considerably, but that nonetheless indicate a genuine massiveness of scale unprecedented in the crusading movement since the First Crusade of the late 11th century. The march of the crusading army from its assembly point through the Balkans and into Byzantine territory generated its own diplomatic complications, as the simultaneous passage of French and German crusading forces through Byzantine lands created tensions with the Emperor Manuel I Comnenus that required careful management and that reflected the fundamental ambiguity of the relationship between the Byzantine Empire and the Latin crusading movement, which was simultaneously a source of potential military support and a force whose behavior within Byzantine territory threatened the stability of imperial administration and the diplomatic relationships that Manuel was attempting to maintain with his various neighbors. The French army's passage through Anatolia, following the route that had been used by the First Crusade and that traversed some of the most difficult and militarily dangerous terrain in the region, proved catastrophic in the mountain passes near Laodicea in January of 1148, where Seljuk Turkish forces attacked the army from the heights above the route and inflicted serious casualties on the crusading forces before they could organize effective resistance. The disaster near Laodicea exposed multiple failures of military organization and strategic intelligence that the crusading leadership subsequently attributed to various causes, including the failure of specific contingents to maintain the march discipline that the dangerous terrain required, a failure for which Eleanor and her household were among those blamed in the accounts of hostile chroniclers writing some years after the events. These attributions of blame, which appear primarily in the account of John of Salisbury and in the later chronicle tradition, cannot be assessed with confidence on the basis of the surviving evidence and reflect the tendency of medieval chroniclers to seek personal explanations for systemic failures, particularly when one of the individuals available for blame was a politically controversial woman whose conduct throughout the expedition had generated the kind of commentary that made further allegations appear plausible to readers already inclined to view Eleanor's behaviour with suspicion. The arrival of the battered and diminished French crusading army at the Principality of Antioch in March of 1148, where Eleanor's maternal uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, ruled as prince, created the conditions for the episode that would become the most famous and most contested moment of Eleanor's first marriage, and that would generate, in its immediate aftermath, the decisive break between Eleanor and Louis that made the eventual dissolution of their marriage not merely possible but politically inevitable. Raymond's strategic interest in Edessa, whose recovery would significantly strengthen his principality's northern frontier, led him to propose to Louis that the crusading army direct its military efforts toward this objective rather than proceeding to Jerusalem, a proposal that had genuine military merit and that Eleanor, whose political intelligence recognized the coherence of Raymond's strategic argument, publicly supported against her husband's alternative preference for proceeding directly to the Holy City. The conflict between Eleanor and Louis over Raymond's proposal escalated within days from a policy dispute into a personal confrontation in which Eleanor invoked the canonical prohibition on marriage within certain degrees of consanguinity as grounds for demanding an annulment of their marriage, a demand that Louis refused, before effectively compelling Eleanor to accompany the army when it departed Antioch for the south. The allegations that circulated in the following months and years about the nature of Eleanor's relationship with Raymond represent one of the most persistent examples in medieval historical writing of the misogynistic tradition that attributed women's political independence to sexual misconduct, a tradition whose accounts tell us considerably more about the anxieties and rhetorical conventions of their authors than about the actual conduct of their subjects, and that modern scholarship has consistently identified as providing no reliable historical evidence about Eleanor's personal behaviour during her stay at Antioch. The failed siege of Damascus in July of 1148, which represented the military culmination of the Second Crusade and its most comprehensive humiliation, exposed the strategic incoherence of an enterprise that had been planned with inadequate attention to the actual political situation in the Latin East and executed with a collective leadership insufficiently coordinated to overcome the organizational challenges that such a large and diverse military force inevitably presented. The decision to besiege Damascus, which was at the time the nearest thing to a diplomatic partner the Crusader states possessed among the Muslim powers of the region, represented a strategic error of the first order that undermined whatever goodwill had been created between the Crusader states and the Damascene Emirate by decades of occasionally cooperative relations along their shared frontier. The abandonment of the siege after only 4 days, attributed in different accounts to military inadequacy, treacherous counsel by the Jerusalem barons, who allegedly preferred Damascus's continued independence to its acquisition by the crusading lords, and the appearance of a relieving Muslim army sufficiently large to make continued siege operations untenable, completed the process by which the Crusade's failure became impossible to disguise. The return of Louis and Eleanor to France in the autumn of 1148 and the subsequent year left the marriage in a condition of public deterioration that papal intervention briefly addressed but could not ultimately repair. Pope Eugenius III's meeting with the royal couple at Tusculum in 1149, at which the Pope reportedly attempted to facilitate a reconciliation by arranging for them to share sleeping quarters, represents one of the more unusual episodes in the history of 12th century papal diplomacy and illustrates the degree to which the marriage's difficulties had become sufficiently public to require intervention at the highest level of ecclesiastical authority. The resulting pregnancy produced a second daughter, Alix, born in 1151, rather than the male heir whose birth might have altered the political calculation sufficiently to justify the marriage's continuation despite its personal dysfunction, and the reconciliation that the papal intervention had produced proved as superficial as the circumstances of its achievement suggested it must be. The formal proceedings that dissolved the marriage began gathering momentum in the early months of 1152, driven by the political calculus of both parties and by the accumulated evidence that the marriage had achieved none of its primary objectives. It had produced no male heir, It had failed to generate the stable governance of Aquitaine under French royal authority that Louis's advisors had hoped for, and it had created in Eleanor a figure of political controversy whose presence at the Capetian court had been a source of ongoing difficulty rather than the asset that her wealth and her territorial inheritance had initially promised to provide. The Council of French Bishops convened at Beaugency on the 18th of March in 1152 pronounced the annulment of the marriage on grounds of consanguinity with a speed that testified to the degree to which the outcome had been agreed by all parties before the formal proceedings began. The consanguinity argument, which pointed to the fact that Eleanor and Louis were related within the fourth degree of kinship through a connection in their shared ancestry, was legally genuine rather than merely pretextual. The prohibition had been known and acknowledged since the beginning of the marriage, but had been disregarded when the political advantages of the union made the canonical irregularity acceptable to all concerned parties, and its invocation now reflected the decision by both parties that the political disadvantages of continuing the marriage exceeded whatever advantages its continuation might offer. The annulment restored Eleanor to full possession and independent governance of Aquitaine and placed her once again in the position she had occupied at 15 as the most sought-after territorial heiress in the Western world, with the additional dimension that she was now a woman of approximately 30 years, whose political intelligence and political assertiveness had been demonstrated across 15 years of queenship in ways that made her simultaneously more formidable and more alarming as a prospective wife than she had been at the time of her first marriage. The danger of abduction and forced remarriage that had attended her father's death now reappeared in a more acute form, since Eleanor was travelling through territories controlled by lords whose military capacity gave them the means to attempt the kind of seizure that feudal law found difficult to condemn when executed by a sufficiently powerful actor, and two separate attempts by regional lords to intercept her party and compel her marriage were reportedly made and barely evaded during the weeks between the annulment and her arrival at Poitiers. What Eleanor's enemies could not know, and what contemporary observers did not realize until the event made it impossible to overlook, was that she had already arranged her second marriage before the ink on the annulment was dry. The marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine to Henry Plantagenet, Count of Anjou, Duke of Normandy, and claimant to the English throne, was celebrated at the Cathedral of Saint-Pierre in Poitiers on the 18th of May in 1152, 8 weeks after the formal dissolution of Eleanor's marriage to Louis, and in circumstances of deliberate speed that testified to both parties' recognition that the political moment for their union was narrow and that delay would create opportunities for intervention by the external powers, primarily Louis of France and his advisors, who would have preferred to prevent the marriage and who would certainly have attempted to do so had they received sufficient warning. The negotiations for the marriage had clearly been conducted through intermediaries for some weeks or months before the annulment. Since the logistical and diplomatic preparation required for a marriage between two of the greatest territorial lords in the Western world could not have been accomplished in 8 weeks without prior groundwork, Henry Plantagenet was, at the time of the marriage, 19 years of age, approximately 11 years younger than Eleanor, a figure of already remarkable political and military accomplishment, who had spent the preceding years successfully asserting his claim to the Duchy of Normandy by military force, and who was simultaneously pursuing through diplomatic means the claim to the English throne that derived from his mother, the Empress Matilda. His character, as described in the surviving sources, possesses a vividness that suggests genuine observation rather than conventional literary elaboration. He was of middle height, stocky and powerfully built, with reddish hair cut short, grey eyes that contemporaries described as capable of extraordinary intensity, and the restless, electric energy that made it impossible for him to remain still for extended periods, and that his courtiers and officials found simultaneously impressive and exhausting. His intellectual capacities were exceptional by any standard of comparison available in the 12th century, encompassing mastery of multiple languages, an engagement with legal and administrative questions that went beyond the conventional interest of even the most capable secular rulers, and a memory that contemporaries found almost uncanny in its retention of the details of cases, disputes, and personal relationships across the enormous geographical expanse of his domains. The political logic of the marriage between Eleanor and Henry was evident to everyone who observed it, though the speed and the secrecy with which it was arranged prevented Louis of France from taking the countermeasures that his recognition of the marriage's implications would have motivated. Eleanor brought to the union the vast territorial wealth of Aquitaine, which provided both the resources necessary for the military campaigns Henry was planning and the southern French legitimacy that would facilitate the acceptance of his authority over the Aquitanian vassals who owed their primary loyalty to their duchess. Henry brought to the union the military capacity and the political standing as the most powerful lord in northern France that Eleanor needed to defend Aquitaine against the Capetian pressure that the dissolution of her first marriage had made more rather than less acute, and the prospective claim to the English throne that, if successfully prosecuted, would give the territorial agglomeration they jointly controlled a scale and a character that had no precedent in the political history of the Western Latin world. The combined domains of Henry and Eleanor Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, Poitou, and Aquitaine formed a territorial bloc that surrounded the royal domain of France on three sides and that possessed in aggregate a population, a revenue base, and a military capacity that significantly exceeded those of the Capetian monarchy, creating the political entity that historians would subsequently designate as the Angevin Empire, and that contemporaries recognized immediately as a transformation of the political landscape of Western Europe of the most fundamental kind. Louis VII received the news of Eleanor's remarriage with the consternation that the political consequences of the marriage fully justified, and his attempts to prevent its consolidation through support for the rebellious barons of Normandy and through diplomatic pressure on various parties were insufficient to prevent Henry from establishing effective control over the combined territories, or from pursuing the campaign for the English throne that the Treaty of Wallingford of November 1153 concluded in his favour by establishing him as the heir of the reigning King Stephen of Blois. Henry became King of England on the 19th of December in 1154 following Stephen's death, and Eleanor was crowned alongside him at Westminster Abbey in a ceremony that gave formal ceremonial expression to the political reality that their marriage had created, making her simultaneously Queen of England, Duchess of Normandy, Countess of Anjou, Countess of Poitou, and Duchess of Aquitaine, a concatenation of titles that made her the most powerful woman in the Western Christian world, and that reflected the extraordinary territorial achievement of the political calculation she had executed across the spring of 1152 with such precise effectiveness. The governance of the Angevin Empire that Henry and Eleanor constructed across the decade following their marriage required organizational capabilities of a high order and generated administrative innovations that would prove among the most durable institutional legacies of the entire Plantagenet period. The empire was not a unified political entity in any modern sense of the term, but rather a collection of territories, each governed according to its own customs, each maintaining its own administrative apparatus, and each connected to the others, primarily through the personal authority of the ruler who presided over them all, and through the gradually developing bureaucratic systems that Henry's administrative energy was generating across every dimension of governance in each of the constituent territories. The challenge of managing this diversity required the kind of perpetual motion that Henry's temperament provided with apparent inexhaustibility, an almost incessant movement across the territories of the empire that served both the practical requirement of medieval kingship, which depended on the physical presence of the monarch to be effective in a world without reliable bureaucratic systems capable of independent action, and Henry's own personal disposition toward activity, which contemporaries found extraordinary even by the standards of the most energetic medieval rulers. Eleanor's governance activity during the early years of the reign encompassed not merely the ceremonial and reproductive functions that the conventional model of queenly authority assigned to royal consorts, but the actual exercise of administrative authority in territories where her personal standing as duchess gave her access to local loyalty and cooperation that Henry's external authority as king and count could not always command with equal effectiveness. The specific instances of Eleanor's independent governance that can be recovered from the documentary record include the issuance of charters in her own name as Duchess and Countess, the reception of appeals from Aquitanian vassals that she adjudicated through her own ducal court, and the management of the complex network of relationships with the regional lords of the south that required the kind of personal familiarity and continued attention that only direct administration could maintain. The 8 children that Eleanor bore to Henry between 1153 and 1167 represented the most visible product of their marriage in conventional dynastic terms and constituted in themselves a political achievement of the first order for a dynasty whose establishment required the provision of adequate heirs to secure the complex territorial inheritance across which the couple presided. The eldest surviving son, Henry, born in 1155, was designated the young king following his coronation as co-ruler of England in 1170, a title that would prove cruelly ironic as the years of his life passed without the actual authority that royal status demanded. Richard, born in 1157, absorbed at Eleanor's Poitevin court the cultural values and the political instincts that would make him the most celebrated warrior of his age and the most devoted of Eleanor's sons. Geoffrey, born in 1158, was given Brittany through marriage to its heiress Constance and displayed the political ruthlessness and the tactical intelligence that the Angevin bloodline demonstrated in its most concentrated expressions. Eleanor, born in 1162, married Alfonso VIII of Castile and became the grandmother of Blanche of Castile, one of the most consequential political figures of the 13th century. Joan, born in 1165, would marry William II of Sicily and then Raymond VI of Toulouse in a second marriage arranged by Eleanor during the Third Crusade. John, born in 1167, the youngest child to survive into adulthood, would inherit the English throne in 1199 under circumstances that combined the tragedy of Richard's death with the institutional crisis that the loss of continental territories would generate in the early 13th century. The management of this extraordinary family across the territorial expanse of the Angevin domains required organizational capabilities that went far beyond the conventional maternal function, encompassing the direction of their educations to prepare them for the specific territorial responsibilities they would eventually assume, the management of their political relationships with the lords and institutions of the various territories over which they were designated to exercise authority, and the cultivation of the personal loyalties and political networks that would determine the effectiveness of their eventual governance. Eleanor's most significant contribution to this educational enterprise was her direction of Richard's formation at Poitiers, where the cultural environment she created gave the future king an understanding of the southern French political tradition, a command of Occitan poetry, and a political sensibility shaped by the values of the troubadour world that distinguished him from his brothers in ways that subsequent events would prove consequential. The conflict between Henry II and Thomas Beckett, Archbishop of Canterbury, which dominated English political life between 1162 and 1170, created the context within which Eleanor's gradual withdrawal from active participation in the English court accelerated, and within which the political environment that would eventually generate the rebellion of 1173 began to develop. Beckett had been Henry's chancellor from 1155 to 1162, serving in that capacity with exceptional administrative effectiveness and becoming in the process one of the most powerful figures in English governance, a man whose wealth, whose political connections, and whose intimacy with the king's intentions made him simultaneously invaluable to Henry's administrative program and a source of the kind of concentrated power that Henry's system of governance otherwise sought to prevent from developing in any single individual. Henry's appointment of Beckett to the Archbishopric of Canterbury in 1162, motivated by the calculation that having his most trusted political ally as the head of the English Church would facilitate the extension of royal administrative authority into areas of jurisdiction that the Church had historically defended as exclusively ecclesiastical, proved to be one of the most catastrophic miscalculations of Henry's reign. Since Beckett, upon assuming the archbishopric, underwent what contemporaries described as a complete transformation of character and purpose, abandoning the worldly values and the political loyalties of his chancellorship to embrace the institutional interests of the church he now led, with a thoroughness that made him the most formidable opponent Henry had yet encountered in any sphere of governance. The dispute that developed between the two men over the respective jurisdictions of royal and ecclesiastical courts, crystallized in the constitutions of Clarendon in 1164 and generating Becket's subsequent exile in France, was in its immediate form a dispute about institutional competence that the medieval church and secular rulers had been negotiating across generations of conflict and accommodation. In its deeper significance, however, it was a collision between Henry's ambitious program of expanding royal administrative authority across every domain of English life and the Church's equally ambitious program of maintaining the institutional autonomy, jurisdictional independence that the Gregorian reform movement had established as fundamental principles of proper Christian governance. Eleanor's relationship with Becket during the years of his chancellorship had been one of mutual wariness that never developed into open conflict, but that reflected the recognition by both parties that their respective positions in Henry's court placed them in a relationship of potential competition for access to Henry's confidence and for influence over the decisions that shaped the governance of the Angevin Empire. Specific areas of tension between Eleanor and Becket during the chancellorship period are attested in the surviving sources and indicate that Becket's understanding of his role as Henry's primary advisor did not always accommodate Eleanor's attempts to influence policy on matters relating to the governance of Aquitaine and the management of the southern territories. The murder of Becket in Canterbury Cathedral on the 29th of December in 1170, the result of 4 nights' impulsive interpretation of Henry's expression of rage as a commission to act on his behalf, created a political crisis of European dimensions that generated a papal interdict over Henry's territories, forced public penance, and permanently damaged Henry's reputation as a Christian ruler in ways that his subsequent governance could never entirely repair. The political consequences of the Becket affair for Eleanor were indirect but significant. The weakening of Henry's political authority through the moral fallout of the Archbishop's murder, the necessity of making substantial concessions to ecclesiastical interests as the price of papal absolution, and the general atmosphere of political crisis and institutional instability that the affair generated, all created conditions in which the grievances of Henry's sons and the ambitions of the regional lords, who felt constrained by his administrative centralization, found more room to develop and to organize themselves into the active political challenge that would eventually take the form of the rebellion of 1173. Eleanor's increasing residence at Poitiers during the late 1160s, effectively establishing an independent court that administered Aquitaine directly, reflected both the deterioration of her relationship with Henry and a political calculation about where her authority and her energies could be most effectively deployed in a situation where her access to the centre of Angevin power was becoming increasingly restricted by the combined effect of Henry's own political style and the specific tensions that had developed between them over the governance of the empire. The court that Eleanor established at Poitiers, the years between approximately 1168 and 1173, during which she effectively administered her ancestral duchy as a quasi-independent political entity, while providing the institutional environment within which the network of relationships and shared political objectives that animated the rebellion of 1173 was developed and maintained, has been the subject of more romantic elaboration and more ahistorical mythologizing than almost any other aspect of her career. The reality of the Poitevin court was in many ways more interesting than the myth, and more historically significant than the romantic tradition of the courts of love that subsequent literary and historical commentary constructed around it. Eleanor's administration at Poitiers drew together the most important political and cultural figures of the Aquitanian tradition, providing patronage to troubadour poets whose compositions addressed some of the most fundamental questions of political loyalty and personal worth that the Southern tradition had developed as its central concerns, and creating an institutional environment in which the values of the Southern court culture found their most complete and consequential practical expression. The poets associated with Eleanor's court during this period included figures whose work represents the most significant achievement of the Occitan literary tradition in the third quarter of the 12th century, among them Bernard de Ventadorn, whose compositions addressed to Eleanor constitute some of the most celebrated examples of troubadour lyric in the entire canon of Occitan poetry, and the anonymous authors of the earliest versions of the Arthurian romance cycle that were developing at precisely this period in the creative synthesis of Celtic narrative material, classical Latin literary convention, and the values of the troubadour tradition that would produce the major romances of the late 12th and early 13th centuries. The political significance of Eleanor's Poitevin court lay not primarily in its cultural productions, however remarkable, but in its function as the institutional space within which the discontent of Eleanor's sons with their father's governance was developed, organized, and given a political program capable of generating a rebellion of dynastic dimensions. The young king, Henry's eldest surviving son, visited his mother's court at Poitiers with sufficient frequency during the late 1160s and early 1170s to absorb the political values and the governing model that Eleanor was demonstrating there, and to develop the personal relationships with the Aquitanian lords and the wider network of politically disaffected figures whose support would eventually make the rebellion possible. Richard, whose formation at Poitiers during precisely this period gave him his most important political education, developed under Eleanor's direct influence an understanding of lordship and political authority rooted in the southern tradition that emphasized the personal relationship between a lord and his vassals, the importance of generosity and cultural sophistication in the construction of political legitimacy, and the degree to which effective governance required the demonstration of the specific qualities that the courtly tradition valued as the marks of genuine nobility. Geoffrey, whose political intelligence was recognized by contemporaries as perhaps the sharpest of Henry's sons, also participated in the political life of Eleanor's Poitevin court, though his relationship with Eleanor appears to have been more complex and more ambivalent than Richard's evident affinity with the values she represented. The combination of these three princes at a court that was simultaneously a cultural centre, an administrative apparatus, and a gathering point for the political discontent generated by Henry's governance, created the conditions for the rebellion in ways that no single factor could have accomplished independently, and Eleanor's role in creating and maintaining these conditions was recognised by Henry's reaction to her capture in 1173, which treated her participation in the rebellion as both more serious and more personally significant than the participation of any of her sons. The rebellion of 1173 and 1174 constituted the most serious internal challenge to the Angevin Empire during Henry's reign, and the moment at which Eleanor's political agency as an independent actor achieved its most dramatic and most consequential expression, generating consequences that would determine the shape of her remaining life and that would continue to influence the politics of the dynasty for decades beyond her own death. The origins of the rebellion can be traced to a convergence of structural grievances and personal ambitions that the political environment of the early 1170s had brought to a point of critical pressure, but the immediate precipitating cause was the political situation of the young king, who had been crowned co-ruler of England in June of 1170 in a ceremony designed to secure the succession, but who was subsequently denied any real administrative authority, any independent revenues, or any meaningful political role in the governance of the kingdom, over whose name he shared the royal title with his father. The anomaly of the young king's position was not lost on the other great lords of England and France, who recognized in his situation an illustration of Henry's fundamental unwillingness to delegate genuine authority to any subordinate, a characteristic of Henry's governance that the long experience of his reign had demonstrated was as applicable to his own sons as to any other member of the political class whose cooperation his administration required. The young king's flight to the court of Louis VII in France in March of 1173, accompanied by his brothers Richard and Geoffrey, transformed what might have been a family dispute into a conflict of dynastic dimensions, since Louis's formal support for the rebellion gave it the external political backing that transformed the prince's personal grievances into a challenge to Henry's authority that carried the weight of the most powerful, competing monarch in the Western world. Eleanor's participation in the rebellion was not merely passive support for her son's cause or the political direction of the cultural environment that had helped to create it. Contemporary sources indicate that in the early months of 1173 she actively attempted to travel from Poitiers to join her sons at the French court, reportedly travelling disguised in male attire in an effort to avoid the detection that would have prevented her journey. She was intercepted by forces loyal to Henry before she could complete this journey, captured and taken to his custody, an outcome that testified both to the seriousness of her commitment to the rebellion and to the quality of Henry's intelligence network, which had learned of her movements with sufficient promptness to intercept her before she could place herself beyond his reach. Henry's suppression of the rebellion was accomplished across the autumn and winter of 1173 and 1174 through a combination of military effectiveness and diplomatic flexibility that reflected the organizational superiority of his administrative apparatus over the coalition that had assembled against him. The Scottish king William the Lion, who had invaded northern England in support of the rebellion, was captured at Alnwick in July of 1174, an event that effectively ended the rebellion's military viability by eliminating one of its most important external supporters and demonstrating to the remaining participants that Henry's capacity for decisive military action was undiminished by the political crisis he was simultaneously managing on multiple fronts. The peace settlements concluded with Henry's sons in the autumn of 1174 restored them to their father's peace on terms that confirmed their dynastic expectations while preserving their immediate dependence on his authority, an arrangement that solved the short-term problem of the rebellion while leaving intact the structural tensions that had generated it. The treatment of Eleanor was an entirely different matter. Henry could afford to be generous to sons whose eventual succession to his territories made their reconciliation politically necessary. He could not afford to be generous to a wife whose capacity for independent political action had been demonstrated in the most unambiguous possible terms, and whose freedom would constitute an ongoing political threat to whatever stability the rebellion's suppression had purchased. Eleanor was taken into captivity in 1174 and would remain under Henry's control for the next 15 years, until his death removed the authority that had imposed the constraint, and the son, who most completely shared her political values, could act on the loyalty that his formation at her court had created. The 15 years of Poitiers. Eleanor's captivity between 1174 and 1189 represented an episode without precedent in the political history of medieval queenship, and constituted the most sustained test of Eleanor's political identity and personal endurance in a career filled with demanding tests of both. The physical conditions of her captivity, while not those of a conventional prison in the medieval sense of that term, were nonetheless a fundamental deprivation of the liberty of movement and independent governance that Eleanor had exercised throughout her adult life, and that were as essential to her political identity as the territorial wealth and the dynastic connections that gave that identity its external form. She was held at various locations across England, including Sarum, Winchester, Berkhamsted, and Ludgershall, among others, moving between these locations apparently according to Henry's assessment of the political situation rather than according to any fixed arrangement, and attended by a household appropriate to her rank as Queen and Duchess that provided the material comforts of aristocratic life while denying the political autonomy that gave those comforts their context. Eleanor retained her title as Queen of England and Duchess of Aquitaine throughout the captivity period, a retention that was both a formal acknowledgement of her status and a practical political necessity, since the annulment of her Aquitanian title would have raised questions about the succession to the duchy that Henry had no interest in opening. She was permitted to receive visitors and to maintain correspondence within limits determined by her custodians, a degree of access to the political world that made her captivity something less than total isolation from the events and the people that shaped the Angevin political landscape, even as it prevented the direct engagement with political affairs that her intelligence and her experience disposed her to attempt. The political events of the captivity period unfolded without Eleanor's direct participation, but with consequences that she observed and that informed the political choices she would make upon the recovery of her freedom. The death of the young king in June of 1183, occurring during a campaign of rebellion against his own father in the Limousin, that the younger Henry had launched in the context of disputes about the governance of Poitou, removed the eldest of Eleanor's sons, and the one whose relationship with her had generated much of the political energy that had animated the rebellion of 1173. The death of Geoffrey in August of 1186, at a tournament at Paris in which he was struck by a horse and fatally injured, eliminated the second of Eleanor's surviving sons, and a figure whose political intelligence contemporaries had recognized as among the sharpest of Henry's children, leaving Richard as the eldest surviving son and the heir to the Angevin inheritance, whose governance was increasingly becoming the central political problem of Henry's later years. Henry's relationship with Richard during the period between Geoffrey's death and Henry's own death in 1189 deteriorated from the manageable tension that had characterized much of the preceding decade into an open conflict that engaged Philip of France as Richard's active political ally and that generated the military campaign of the summer of 1189 that would prove Henry's last. Philip II Augustus, who had succeeded Louis VII in 1180, was a considerably more formidable political adversary than his father had been, possessed of a strategic intelligence and a willingness to exploit family divisions within the Angevin dynasty that made him the most dangerous opponent Henry had yet faced, and whose alliance with Richard gave the conflict the character of a coordinated assault on Henry's authority from within and without his empire simultaneously. Henry died at Chinon on the 6th of July in 1189, having received in the final days of his life the news that his youngest son John, whom he had believed loyal in a way that his other sons had proved not to be, had also joined the coalition against him. The chronicler Roger of Hoveden recorded the tradition that Henry, upon learning of John's betrayal, turned his face to the wall and wept, and that this grief hastened his death, a tradition that, whatever its literal accuracy, captures the essential tragic logic of a king who had alienated his political allies, broken the loyalty of his sons, and consumed his empire's resources in an effort to maintain a concentration of personal authority that the political system he governed could not sustain across a single generation. The death of Henry II transformed Eleanor's political situation with a completeness and a speed that the 15 years of captivity had made it difficult to anticipate in its fullness, even for a political intelligence as acute as Eleanor's. Richard's first act, upon assuming the full authority of his position as heir and successor, was to authorize his mother's release, and Eleanor's response to this restoration of her freedom was immediate, comprehensive, and characteristic of the woman she had always been. Rather than retreating to the familiar comforts of her Poitevin estates or to the religious contemplation that women of her age, in her period, conventionally embraced, she moved at once into the full exercise of political authority with a confidence and an effectiveness that demonstrated the degree to which 15 years of enforced political inactivity had done nothing to diminish the quality of the political intelligence and administrative experience she brought to governance. Eleanor travelled through England in the weeks between Henry's death and Richard's arrival from the continent, exercising what amounted to a quasi-regental authority over the English administration, whose officials recognized her standing and deferred to her direction in the management of the governmental apparatus. She released prisoners from royal jails, an act of calculated political generosity designed to begin Richard's reign with a demonstration of royal clemency that would generate goodwill among the English political class and establish a tone of magnanimity that contrasted favourably with the more constrained political style of Henry's later years. She received the homage and the expressions of loyalty of the English barons and administrators who were navigating the uncertainty of the transitional period between reigns, providing through her personal authority and her historical position as queen the kind of political continuity that the administrative system required to function effectively during the interval before Richard's personal presence could restore the full authority of kingship. Richard's coronation at Westminster Abbey on the 3rd of September in 1189, was the occasion that formally inaugurated the new reign and that provided Eleanor with her most complete public restoration to the see-day. Prominence that her position demanded and that Henry's captivity had denied her for 15 years. Her presence at the coronation carried multiple layers of significance. She was the mother of the new king, the Dowager Queen of England, the Duchess of Aquitaine, the most historically significant woman in the Angevin political world, and the figure whose political judgment and experience constituted a resource of the First Order for a reign that would, from its earliest days, face challenges of extraordinary difficulty. The subsequent months of Richard's reign saw Eleanor engaged in the organizational preparation for the Third Crusade, with the same comprehensive engagement in governance that had characterized the most active periods of her earlier career, directing fiscal and administrative efforts on a scale that required the full deployment of the English government's institutional capabilities, and that generated the resources without which Richard's crusading enterprise could not have been mounted with the ambition that he brought to its planning. The diplomatic mission that Eleanor undertook in the winter of 1189 and 1190 to collect Berenguela of Navarre and escort her to Sicily, where she was to be married to Richard, constituted one of the most demanding physical and diplomatic undertakings of Eleanor's entire career, accomplished at an age that would have given most of her contemporaries ample justification for declining the enterprise. The marriage between Richard and Berenguela had been arranged as part of the diplomatic preparation for the Crusade, providing Richard with the domestic alliance with Navarre that helped to secure the southern frontiers of the Aquitanian inheritance during his absence, and the legitimate queen, whose presence in his household the political conventions of the period required. Eleanor collected Berenguela from the Navarrese court and escorted her northward through France, across the Alps in winter conditions, and southward through Italy to the Sicilian port, where Richard's crusading fleet was assembling. A journey of several thousand miles through difficult terrain and variable political conditions that required the combination of physical endurance and diplomatic effectiveness that Eleanor had been demonstrating throughout her adult life, and that she continued to demonstrate at an age that made the combination remarkable by any standard of comparison. The Third Crusade, which Richard prosecuted with the military brilliance and the logistical mastery that made it the most effectively conducted of the major crusading expeditions, produced the reconquest of the coastal territories that Saladin had seized, following his victory at the Battle of Hattin in 1187, including the reconquest of Acre and the recovery of significant portions of the Palestinian coast, but fell short of the ultimate objective of Jerusalem's reconquest, a failure that Richard attributed to the failure of his crusading allies to maintain the military commitment that the enterprise required, and that subsequent historical analysis attributes to the fundamental strategic imbalance between the crusading forces and the resources available to Saladin's sultanate. Richard's return from the Holy Land in October of 1192 proved as militarily and diplomatically complex as the expedition itself. Shipwrecked near Venice and forced to travel overland through the territory of Duke Leopold of Austria, whom he had insulted at Acre by having the Austrian banner torn down from the walls of the city after its capture, Richard was recognized and captured in December of 1192 near Vienna and delivered to the custody of the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, who imposed a ransom demand of 100,000 marks of silver as the price of his release. Eleanor received the news of Richard's capture with the kind of controlled political response that her decades of political experience had prepared her to produce, even in circumstances of acute personal difficulty. She immediately began organizing the diplomatic and fiscal operations that would be required for the ransoms assembly, drawing on the entire apparatus of the English governmental system and the personal authority she commanded within it to mount the most ambitious financial operation in the history of the English monarchy to that point. The extraordinary fiscal measures required an unprecedented levy on movable property across England and the Norman territories, the seizure of church plate with papal authorization, the collection of contributions from every segment of English society were coordinated through Eleanor's personal direction with a systematic effectiveness that the English government, operating under the nominal leadership of the justiciars, could not have achieved without the authority and the political intelligence she provided. Eleanor's correspondence with the Pope during this period, demanding papal intervention on behalf of a captive Crusader king, and using language that combined the formal elegance of medieval Latin epistolary rhetoric with a directness of challenge to papal authority that was almost unprecedented in documents addressed by secular rulers to the papacy, represents one of the most remarkable exercises in political prose produced in the 12th century Latin West, and provides the clearest surviving evidence of Eleanor's political voice and her understanding of the legitimate deployment of every available instrument of political pressure in the service of a cause she considered both just and urgent. The release of Richard I from imperial captivity in February of 1194, accomplished through the assembly of a substantial portion of the demanded ransom and the negotiation of diplomatic guarantees satisfactory to Emperor Henry VI, marked the successful conclusion of the most demanding political and financial operation of Eleanor's career, and restored to the Angevin inheritance the military and political leadership whose absence had created a crisis of governance extending across every dimension of the empire's operation. Eleanor was present at Richard's release in Mainz, having travelled to Germany to accompany her son on the journey home, a journey that completed one of the most dramatic episodes in a career filled with dramatic episodes, and that restored to active service. The political partnership between Eleanor and Richard that had been the most important governing resource of the Angevin inheritance during the years of Henry's captivity. Richard's return to England in March of 1194 initiated the political reconstruction that the captivity period had made necessary, including the suppression of John's usurpatory activities, the reassertion of royal authority over an administrative system that had been functioning without consistent royal direction for more than a year, and the resumption of the war with Philip of France that Richard's capture had interrupted. The military campaigns of Richard's final years as king demonstrated the tactical and strategic brilliance that contemporaries recognized as his most distinctive quality as a ruler, producing significant territorial gains along the Norman frontier and generating the strategic vision that found its most permanent physical expression in the construction of Château Gaillard, the great fortress commanding the Seine Valley at Les Andelys that Richard built between 1196 and 1198 as the keystone of his defensive system against French encroachment into Norman territory. Eleanor's role during these final years of Richard's reign was one of somewhat reduced direct political engagement compared to the crisis years of the captivity, since the restoration of Richard's active governance diminished the scope for the quasi-regental authority she had exercised during his absence. She retained her position as the most politically respected member of the Angevin dynasty, maintained the network of relationships with English barons, ecclesiastical authorities, and continental lords that gave her continued political influence, and continued to exercise the kind of quiet governance of Aquitaine that her long experience of the duchy's political dynamics made her uniquely qualified to provide. Richard's fatal wound at the siege of Châlus-Chabrol in the Limousin, suffered on the 26th of March in 1199 from a crossbow bolt fired by a defender of the castle whose contents Richard reportedly coveted, developed with devastating rapidity into a condition whose treatment exposed the limits of 12th century surgical knowledge, the infection spreading from the wound into the surrounding tissue and generating the systemic condition that made Richard's death increasingly certain within days of the injury. Eleanor was summoned to Châlus and arrived before her son died, providing him with the maternal presence that the emotional conventions of the period required, and that the personal relationship between them over the preceding decades of political partnership and mutual devotion made the most natural and the most necessary response to a dying man's final hours. Richard died on the 6th of April in 1199, having designated his brother John as his successor, having received the rites of the church in proper form, and having been attended in his final hours by the mother who had, in the most literal political sense, created the conditions that had made his remarkable kingship possible. The succession of John to the English throne and to the Angevin territories in the spring of 1199 created a political situation of acute complexity that required from Eleanor a series of rapid political decisions made under conditions of uncertainty and urgency that tested the limits of even her extensive political experience. The competing claim of Arthur of Brittany, the son of Eleanor's deceased son Geoffrey, and therefore in terms of strict primogeniture the nearest male heir in the senior line of the Angevin dynasty, was being actively supported by Philip of France, who recognized in Arthur's minority and his dependence on Breton and French support a political instrument for destabilizing the Angevin inheritance that was considerably more effective than any of the direct military pressure he had been applying along the Norman frontier. Eleanor's decision to support John's succession rather than Arthur's was made on the basis of a clear-eyed assessment of the political situation that reflected the quality of political judgment she had demonstrated. Throughout her career, Arthur was a child controlled by interests hostile to the Angevin inheritance. John was an adult, whatever his personal limitations, capable of conducting the active political and military governance that the defense of the inheritance required. Arthur's success would have placed the Angevin territories under the effective control of Philip of France through the mechanism of Arthur's dependency. John's establishment, with Eleanor's support, offered at least the possibility of maintaining the independence of the Angevin inheritance against the systematic Capetian pressure that had been the defining external threat to the dynasty throughout the preceding decades. Eleanor's active support for John's succession began immediately following Richard's death and took the form of the most extraordinary exercise of personal political authority in the final decade of her career. She conducted what amounted to a political progress through her ancestral duchy in the spring and summer of 1199, travelling on horseback through the principal regions of Aquitaine and receiving the personal homage of the most important lords of the duchy, not in John's name as his agent or representative, but in her own name as Duchess, directly and personally, in a ceremony that renewed the bonds of loyalty between the Duchess and her vassals on the most immediate and personal level available within the feudal system. Having received these homages in her own right, Eleanor then performed her own homage to Philip of France for the duchy, acknowledging the theoretical Capetian suzerainty over Aquitaine in a way that created a specific legal relationship between the French crown and Eleanor personally as Duchess, rather than between the French crown and the Angevin inheritance as a whole. The consequence of this legal maneuver, accomplished with the feudal and canonical expertise that Eleanor had been developing and deploying throughout her career, was to insulate Aquitaine from the political consequences of John's military and political failures in the north. Whatever happened to Normandy, Anjou, and the other Angevin territories in the coming years, Aquitaine's status as Eleanor's personal possession and the specific legal relationship between Eleanor and the French crown that her homage had created would provide a degree of protection that John's own governance could not have secured. This act of territorial consolidation, performed by a woman of approximately 77 years of age, through the physical and diplomatic effort that a progress through the rough terrain of southwestern France required, represents one of the most consequential single political acts of Eleanor's entire career, and one whose importance has been insufficiently appreciated in popular accounts of her life that focus on the more dramatic earlier episodes. The diplomatic mission that Eleanor undertook in the winter of 1199 and 1200 to arrange the marriage of her granddaughter Blanche of Castile with the French Prince Louis was the final major diplomatic enterprise of her life, and was undertaken with a combination of political intelligence and physical determination that had characterized every comparable undertaking across the 6 decades of her active political career. Eleanor travelled personally to the Kingdom of Castile, where her daughter Eleanor was queen, to select from among the Castilian royal daughters the granddaughter most suitable for the French alliance, a process that required both the assessment of individual qualities and the navigation of the complex diplomatic protocol governing relationships between the Spanish and French royal houses. The selection of Blanche, who would prove to be one of the most politically consequential queens of the 13th century as regent of France during her son Louis IX's minority, testified to Eleanor's capacity for identifying political quality in the women around her and to her understanding that the effectiveness of a dynastic alliance depended as much on the personal qualities of the individuals involved as on the formal political arrangements the alliance created. The journey from Castile northward through France, with Blanche in her care, accomplished in the winter conditions of the turn of the century, required the kind of physical endurance and diplomatic management that Eleanor had been demonstrating throughout her career, and its successful completion resulted in the marriage ceremony at Port Mort on the Norman frontier in May of 1200 that created the connection between the Angevin and Capetian dynasties that Eleanor intended to serve as a stabilizing diplomatic bridge between powers whose territorial interests had generated a century of persistent conflict. Blanche of Castile's subsequent political career, which included the governance of France as regent during Louis IX's minority and the exercise of a political authority remarkable by any standard of medieval queenship, reflected the combination of qualities that Eleanor had identified in selecting her for the French marriage, and that the Poitiers heritage, transmitted through Eleanor to her daughter and her granddaughter, had nurtured in a direct line of female political capacity extending across 3 generations. The marriage alliance Eleanor arranged was not merely a diplomatic convenience, but a long-term investment in the stability of the European political order that she had been working to shape across her entire career, and its results in the subsequent decades of the 13th century justified the effort and the physical cost that its arrangement had required of a woman who was, by any reckoning, of extraordinary age for the time and circumstances in which she operated. Eleanor's return from this final diplomatic mission to the quieter surroundings of Fontevraud, where she would spend the remaining years of her life in increasingly frequent residence, marked a transition from the active political engagement that had defined her existence to the contemplative preparation for death that the Christian tradition required of its adherents in their final years. A transition that Eleanor managed with the same combination of political intelligence and personal dignity that she had brought to every other transition of her long and consequential life. The political world she left behind was one that she had shaped in ways both immediate and enduring, and the institutions, the alliances, and the territorial arrangements she had established or preserved through the exercise of her extraordinary political capacity would continue to determine the character of the European political landscape for decades and, in some cases, centuries beyond her own death. The final years of Eleanor's life, from approximately 1200 to her death in April of 1204, were spent with increasing frequency at the Abbey of Fontevraud in Anjou, an institution whose significance within the Angevin dynastic tradition made it the natural final residence for the woman who had done more than any other individual to create and maintain that tradition across the preceding 6 decades. Fontevraud was a double monastery, housing communities of both men and women under the authority of an abbess, an institutional arrangement that gave it a distinctive character within the religious landscape of the 12th and 13th centuries, and one that Eleanor's patronage across the various periods of her active governance had helped to sustain and develop as a centre of religious life, cultural production, and dynastic commemoration. The abbey had received the body of Henry II following his death at Chinon in 1189, and it would receive the body of Richard I following his death at Châlus-Chabrol in 1199, making it the burial place of both of Eleanor's Plantagenet husbands as well as the eventual resting place of Eleanor herself. A concentration of dynastic remains that gave Fontevraud a significance as a place of Plantagenet memory that would prove consequential for its continued importance as an institution associated with royal patronage and dynastic commemoration throughout the 13th century and beyond. The political events of Eleanor's final years were dominated by the catastrophic loss of the continental Angevin territories to Philip of France, a process that accelerated dramatically following John's murder of his nephew Arthur of Brittany in 1203, an act that outraged the Norman and Angevin baronage and deprived John of the political legitimacy necessary to mount an effective defence of his continental possessions against the French military pressure that Philip's strategic, intelligence, and military capacity made it possible to sustain across multiple campaign seasons. Normandy fell to Philip in 1204, and with it, the greater part of the Angevin Empire north of the Loire, the territories that had constituted the nucleus of the political entity that Henry and Eleanor had created through their marriage, and that Eleanor had devoted much of her adult life to governing, defending, and transmitting to the next generation of the dynasty. Eleanor did not live to see the complete consummation of this territorial loss, dying in April of 1204, while the collapse of John's Norman position was still in progress, and while Aquitaine, whose insulation from the consequences of that collapse she had ensured through her own diplomatic action in 1199, remained under Plantagenet control. The survival of Aquitaine as a possession of the English crown for the 2.5 centuries between Eleanor's death and its final loss at the conclusion of the 100 Years' War was in significant measure a consequence of the specific legal and diplomatic arrangements that Eleanor had made in the final years of her life to protect her ancestral duchy from the consequences of the political failures of the men whose governance of the broader inheritance she could observe but could no longer directly shape. Eleanor's death occurred at Fontevraud in the first week of April in 1204, most probably on the first day of the month, following what the surviving sources suggest was a period of declining health during the preceding months that had not prevented her from remaining engaged with the political affairs of the territories she had governed for so long. She had taken the religious veil of the Fontevraud community in the period before her death, a conventional act for aristocratic women of her period, and one that reflected the spiritual priorities of a Christian woman, preparing for the judgment that her tradition taught was the most important encounter of any human life. Whatever the magnitude or the historical significance of the earthly life that preceded it, the tomb effigy that was created at Fontevraud to mark Eleanor's burial place constitutes one of the most remarkable and one of the most studied examples of 12th and 13th century funerary sculpture in the entire corpus of surviving medieval art, and its visual details have generated scholarly debate across multiple generations of art historians, medievalists, and historians of gender that reflects the degree to which the image it presents of Eleanor is simultaneously specific and symbolic, grounded in the observable facts of a historical woman's identity, and simultaneously engaged in the representational conventions that medieval funerary art deployed to communicate meaning beyond the specific characteristics of the stebers. Individual, it commemorated. The effigy depicts Eleanor in the recumbent position, conventional for funerary monuments of the period, dressed in the royal garments, appropriate to her rank, her face rendered with a refinement that suggests the highest quality of artistic production available in the Plantagenet court tradition, and holding in her hands a small book whose pages appear to be open, a detail that has been interpreted variously as indicating the devotional piety of a Christian woman engaged in the spiritual reading appropriate to the contemplative life she had chosen at Fontevraud, and as a reference to Eleanor's long and deep engagement with the literary culture of the troubadour tradition and the emerging vernacular romance literature that her patronage had helped to develop and transmit. The 4 effigy figures at Fontevraud, Henri II, Richard I, Eleanor, and Isabel of Angoulême, John's queen, who was buried there in 1246, constitute together one of the most concentrated groupings of Plantagenet funerary sculpture in existence, providing the visual evidence through which the physical appearances or idealized artistic representations of these historical figures have been transmitted across 8 centuries to the present day. The quality of craftsmanship evident in Eleanor's effigy, the refinement of its execution, and the sophistication of its compositional choices testifies to the importance that Eleanor's memory retained for the dynasty in the years immediately following her death, and to the determination of those who commissioned the work to create a memorial image worthy of a figure whose historical significance they clearly recognized, even if the full dimensions of that significance would only become apparent across the subsequent centuries of historiographical elaboration. The effigy has become, in the centuries since its creation, one of the most immediately recognizable images of a medieval woman in the entire surviving corpus of medieval art, reproduced in countless scholarly and popular publications, displayed in countless exhibitions, and studied by scholars representing a remarkable diversity of disciplinary approaches, whose interest in Eleanor's life and career has given her tomb monument a visibility that few medieval funerary works can match. The familiarity of the Fontevraud effigy in contemporary culture is itself a reflection of the enduring historical interest that Eleanor's life has generated across the centuries since her death, an interest that shows no signs of diminishing as new generations of historians, literary scholars, and popular writers continue to find in the extraordinary career of this 12th century duchess, queen, rebel, and diplomat a set of questions about political authority, gender, and historical agency that remain genuinely important and genuinely unresolved. The assessment of Eleanor of Aquitaine's historical significance has been shaped across the 8 centuries since her death by the competing imperatives of hagiography and defamation, admiration and hostility, romantic celebration and ahistorical mythologizing, in ways that have made the recovery of the historical Eleanor, the specific woman operating within the specific institutional and cultural frameworks of the 12th century Latin West, a genuinely challenging, scholarly enterprise, requiring careful engagement with primary sources whose authors brought to their accounts of Eleanor's life the values, the prejudices, and the rhetorical conventions of their own specific cultural and institutional positions. The earliest and most hostile accounts of Eleanor's career were produced by contemporaries writing in the tradition of northern French male ecclesiastical culture, a tradition that combined deep structural suspicion of female political agency with the rhetorical conventions of misogynistic defamation that attributed the political conflicts in which Eleanor participated to the sexual misconduct, personal willfulness that this cultural tradition associated with women who acted outside the domestic sphere, prescribed for them by the prevailing understanding of female virtue. Walter Map, Gerald of Wales, and other figures of the Angevin court tradition produced accounts of Eleanor that served the interests of those who needed to explain political failures, the failures of Louis's kingship, the failures of Henry's governance by attributing them to the malign influence of a politically active woman whose conduct exceeded the limits that proper femininity required, and whose willingness to deploy institutional mechanisms in the service of her own political objectives could be characterized as evidence of the kind of excessive ambition that the misogynistic tradition attributed to women who refused. The subordination that nature and divine ordinance allegedly prescribed. The southern French sources that developed in the tradition of Eleanor's own cultural heritage offered competing accounts that emphasized her cultural patronage, her maternal devotion, and her political achievements as evidence of the legitimacy of the kind of female authority she had exercised. But these sources operated within a cultural tradition sufficiently marginalized in the broader Latin West that their influence on the dominant historical narrative remained limited throughout the medieval period. The Romantic tradition that developed around Eleanor in the 19th and 20th centuries, driven by the Victorian and Edwardian fascination with the medieval past, and by the specifically feminist interest in historical female political authority that developed across the 20th century, produced some of the most enduring and most widely distributed images of Eleanor's life, while creating, in the process, a figure of almost allegorical female empowerment that preserved Eleanor's historical significance by simplifying it to the point of historical distortion. The Eleanor of the Romantic tradition, the liberated queen, the proto-feminist hero, the woman who defied the patriarchal conventions of her time through the force of her extraordinary personality, is a figure whose appeal is entirely understandable and whose cultural significance is real, but whose relationship to the historical Eleanor, the woman who operated with exceptional effectiveness within, rather than against the institutional frameworks of medieval political life, is one of selective emphasis and romantic elaboration rather than of historical precision. Modern historical scholarship, working from the primary sources with the methodological rigor that the academic historical tradition demands, and drawing on the analytical frameworks of political history, institutional history, cultural history, and gender history that the 20th and 21st centuries have developed, has produced an understanding of Eleanor's career that is simultaneously more historically precise and more genuinely illuminating than the earlier traditions of hagiography and romance allowed. The specific contribution that Eleanor of Aquitaine made to the institutional development of the English monarchy across the 35 years between her marriage to Henry and his death in 1189 is visible in the documentary record of her administrative activities and in the accounts of contemporaries who recognized her effectiveness as a governing authority even when they expressed discomfort or disagreement with the degree of political independence she claimed exercised. The administrative revolution of Henry II's reign, which established the institutional foundations of English common law, developed the system of royal itinerant justices whose circuits created consistent legal standards across the geographical diversity of the English kingdom, and extended the reach of royal administrative authority into domains that had previously been governed primarily by local, custom and baronial prerogative, was an enterprise in which Eleanor's active participation gave it a governing resource that Henry's own administration, however energetic and innovative, could not have provided from within its own ranks. Eleanor's specific administrative contributions included the governance of the English kingdom during Henry's extended absences in his continental territories, the management of the complex political relationships with the English baronage that required the kind of sustained personal attention that Henry's peripatetic style of governance did not always permit him to provide, and the oversight of the judicial and fiscal mechanisms that were being developed during these years into the systematic apparatus of royal administration that subsequent generations of English rulers would inherit and develop further. Eleanor's governance of Aquitaine, both during the periods of her active participation in the Angevin Empire's broader governance and during the years of her effective independent administration at Poitiers in the late 1160s and early 1170s, provided the duchy with the continuity of ducal authority that the management of its complex political relationships with its many vassals required, and maintained the institutional connections between the Aquitanian administration and the broader Angevin governmental system that the empire's effective operation depended on. The specific legal and administrative traditions of Aquitaine, which differed significantly from the common law tradition that was developing in England during the same period, and that reflected the distinct legal culture of the southern French territories, were maintained and transmitted through Eleanor's ducal governance in ways that preserved the duchy's political identity and its relationship with its own vassalry across the periods of acute political instability that characterized the broader Angevin inheritance during the 1170s and 1180s. Eleanor's role in the transmission of cultural values from the southern French tradition to the northern courts of England and Normandy, accomplished through her personal influence on the cultural environment of the courts she presided over and through the specific patronage she directed toward the poets, musicians, and literary figures who moved between the southern and northern traditions, constituted a contribution to the cultural history of the Plantagenet era that is less immediately visible than her political achievements, but no less historically significant in its long-term consequences for the development vernacular literary culture in England and France across the 13th and subsequent centuries. The relationship between Eleanor of Aquitaine and the specific political and institutional context of the Plantagenet dynasty requires careful analysis to understand both the ways in which Eleanor shaped that context and the ways in which it shaped her. Since the historical significance of any individual political actor is always a product of the interaction between their personal capacities and the specific institutional environment within which those capacities are deployed, Eleanor's political capacities, her territorial intelligence, her diplomatic sophistication, her mastery of legal and canonical frameworks as political instruments, her capacity for sustained physical effort across an extraordinary span of years, and the quality of political judgment that allowed her to identify and exploit political opportunities with consistent effectiveness were exceptional by any standard of historical comparison, but they would have produced considerably fewer historical consequences without the specific institutional conditions that gave them room to operate. The most important of these conditions was the territorial wealth of Aquitaine itself. which provided Eleanor not merely with material resources, but with the specific feudal standing that gave her a legitimate claim to independent political authority within the existing institutional framework of the medieval polity. A woman without territorial resources of her own, however politically intelligent, would have found the institutional framework of the 12th century Latin West almost entirely impermeable to the kind of independent political action that Eleanor consistently pursued. A woman with territorial resources sufficient to constitute a great lordship in her own right could invoke those resources as the basis for claims to authority that the feudal system recognized as legitimate, regardless of the gender of the lord making them. The specific nature of Aquitaine's position within the feudal hierarchy of France, as a duchy whose tradition of practical independence from Capetian authority was deeply rooted in the political culture of the region, gave Eleanor's territorial inheritance a character that maximized the political leverage available to its holder and minimized the practical constraints that theoretical subordination to the French crown might otherwise have imposed. The canonical law of marriage, which Eleanor deployed with exceptional effectiveness at two critical junctures of her career: the demand for annulment at Antioch in 1148 and the formal dissolution proceedings at Beaugency in 1152, provided another institutional framework within which her political agency could operate. Since the canonical system recognized grounds for the dissolution of even the most politically significant marriages that could be invoked as legal instruments, regardless of the political preferences of the parties involved, Eleanor's mastery of this framework, her understanding of when and how to activate its mechanisms in the service of her political objectives, was characteristic of the broader pattern of her political methodology, which consistently sought to operate through rather than against the institutional structures of her time, exploiting their internal possibilities rather than challenging their external authority. The feudal law of homage and tenure, which Eleanor deployed in 1199 to create the specific legal relationship between herself and the French crown that insulated Aquitaine from the political consequences of John's failures, provided yet another institutional mechanism that her political intelligence recognized and exploited with a precision that testified to the depth of her understanding of the legal frameworks within which medieval political life operated. These deployments of institutional mechanisms in the service of specific political objectives constitute the most consistently effective and the most historically consequential dimension of Eleanor's political methodology, and they reflect a quality of political intelligence that was rooted in 60 years of accumulated experience and observation, rather than in any formal legal education that the period's institutions could have provided to a woman of her time. The cultural dimension of Eleanor of Aquitaine's political career has attracted scholarly attention, primarily in the context of the literary and artistic patronage she provided at her court at Poitiers and more broadly across her domains during the various periods of her active governance. But the full significance of this cultural dimension extends beyond the specific works produced under her patronage to encompass the broader transmission of southern French cultural values and aesthetic traditions to the northern courts of England and France that occurred through Eleanor's personal agency across 6 decades of cultural mediation. The troubadour tradition that Eleanor patronized at Poitiers was not, as the Romantic tradition has sometimes suggested, a merely decorative element of her political career, an ornament of cultural sophistication added to what was essentially a story of military conflict and dynastic politics. It was an integral dimension of Eleanor's political methodology, since the cultural values that the troubadour tradition embodied: the high estimation of individual distinction, the sophisticated understanding of the performance of identity, the complex negotiation of loyalty and personal worth that the conventions of courtly love provided, were the same values that animated Eleanor's approach to the construction and maintenance of political authority throughout her. The vernacular Romance literature that was developing at precisely the period of Eleanor's most active cultural patronage, synthesizing Celtic narrative material with classical Latin literary conventions and the values of the Occitan troubadour tradition, constitutes one of the most significant literary developments of the 12th century, and the connection between this development and Eleanor's cultural environment, while impossible to trace with complete precision through the fragmentary evidence that survives, is recognized by the majority of literary historians as substantial. The Arthurian cycle, in particular, which achieved its first major literary formulations in the works of figures operating in the cultural orbit of the Plantagenet court during the 1160s and 1170s, reflects values and concerns that are consistent with the cultural environment of Eleanor's Poitiers court in ways that suggest more than coincidental alignment. The development of vernacular literary culture in England, which accelerated significantly during the reigns of Henry II and Richard I, and which produced in the 13th century a body of literary production in French and subsequently in English of growing sophistication, cultural ambition, can be traced in part to the cultural models and the patronage traditions that Eleanor's courts established and that her children and grandchildren transmitted to the succeeding generation of patrons and literary figures. The specific contribution of the Occitan tradition to this development, mediated through Eleanor's personal patronage and through the network of cultural connections that her courts maintained with the southern French literary world, gave the emerging northern literary culture access to formal conventions and thematic concerns that enriched its development in ways that the indigenous northern traditions alone could not have provided. This cultural legacy, less immediately visible than the political and institutional legacy of Eleanor's career, but no less historically significant in the long run, forms an essential component of any comprehensive assessment of her contribution to the history of the Plantagenet era and of the Western medieval tradition more broadly. The question of Eleanor of Aquitaine's place within the broader history of women's political authority in the medieval period is one that requires sustained analytical attention to avoid the characteristic errors of both excessive celebration and ahistorical dismissal that have marked much of the popular discourse about women's political roles in pre-modern societies. Eleanor was not a feminist avant la lettre, not a figure who challenged the structural subordination of women within the political systems of her time, or who sought to transform the institutional frameworks within which she operated in the direction of greater gender equality. She was a woman who exploited with exceptional effectiveness the specific opportunities that her territorial position, her dynastic connections, and her personal capacities created within the existing institutional framework, which was one that recognized women's political authority primarily through the mechanisms of regency, inheritance, and dynastic alliance, rather than through any formal acknowledgement of women's independent political capacity as a general principle. What distinguished Eleanor from other politically active women of the medieval period was not the mechanisms through which she operated, which were in their basic form available to any woman of sufficient territorial wealth and dynastic standing, but the extraordinary combination of resources she commanded, the exceptional duration of her active political career, and the quality of political intelligence she brought to the exploitation of the specific opportunities that her situation created. The comparison between Eleanor and the other powerful women of the Plantagenet era, Empress Matilda, whose claim to the English throne generated the civil war of Stephen's reign, but who was ultimately unable to translate her legal claim into actual possession, Berenguela of Navarre, whose marriage to Richard produced no political partnership comparable to Eleanor's relationship with either of her husbands, Isabella of Angoulême, whose marriage to John and whose subsequent marriage to Hugh of Lusignan generated their own political complications in the 13th century, illuminates by contrast the specific combination of qualities that made Eleanor historically unique rather than merely historically exceptional. Matilda possessed the legal claim and the personal courage, but lacked the territorial base and the political flexibility that would have allowed her to consolidate her position in England against Stephen's resistance. Her failure demonstrates the degree to which Eleanor's success depended not merely on her personal qualities, but on the specific configuration of territorial resources that Aquitaine provided. Berenguela of Navarre demonstrates, through the contrast of her marginal political role in the Angevin system, how completely Eleanor's political significance depended on the territorial standing that Berenguela lacked. the wife of a king without her own independent territorial base, was dependent on the king's goodwill and the king's resources in ways that Eleanor was not, and the political authority she could exercise was therefore confined to the domestic and intercessory spheres, rather than extending to the independent governance and diplomatic action that characterized Eleanor's career. These comparisons suggest that Eleanor's historical significance lies not in demonstrating that women could exercise political power in the medieval period, which the careers of multiple women in multiple cultures across the medieval centuries demonstrate in any case, but in demonstrating the specific combination of territorial resources, personal intelligence, and institutional mastery that could allow an exceptional individual to maximize the opportunities available within the existing framework to a degree that few men, let alone women, achieved across the history of the medieval Latin West. The Plantagenet dynasty that Eleanor helped to establish endured for nearly 2.5 centuries after her death in 1204, generating, in the course of those 2.5 centuries, a series of monarchs whose characters and reigns encompassed an extraordinary range of political experience, from the reforming achievement of Henry III's minority government, when the institutional implications of Magna Carta were gradually worked out by the baronial council that governed England in the young king's name, to the constitutional catastrophe of Edward II's reign, which ended in the first successful deposition of an English king by his own nobility in the post-conquest period, and in the king's murder at Berkeley Castle in 1327, under circumstances whose horror contemporaries acknowledged even as they recognized the political necessity of the act. The long dynasty that Eleanor's marriage to Henry created produced in Edward I, a monarch whose governance of the British Isles, through the conquest of Wales, the attempted conquest of Scotland, and the systematic elaboration of parliamentary governance created the institutional framework of the English state in forms that remained recognizable for centuries. It produced in Edward III a monarch whose foundation of the Order of the Garter, whose pursuit of the French throne, on the basis of a claim derived ultimately from the dynastic politics of the 13th century, and whose court provided the environment within which Geoffrey Chaucer's poetry could find the sophisticated audience it required, created the cultural and political conditions for the English literary tradition's most significant medieval flowering. It produced in Richard II, the last of the Plantagenets, a monarch whose personal intelligence and cultural sophistication were combined with a political miscalculation sufficiently extreme to generate the baronial coalition that deposed him in 1399 and placed the House of Cowles, Lancaster, on the throne, ending the direct Plantagenet line in a drama of dynastic displacement whose consequences continued to shape English politics for another century in the form of the Wars of the Roses. Throughout this long and complex dynastic history, the precedents established during Eleanor's active years continued to operate as governing factors in the institutional and cultural life of the English monarchy. The administrative reforms of Henry II's reign, which Eleanor had supported and participated in as both a governing resource and a political ally, established the foundations of common law and royal administration that proved the most enduring institutional legacy of the Plantagenet period. The cultural patronage associated with Eleanor's courts provided models for the role of royal women as patrons of vernacular literature and artistic production that influenced English queenship across the 13th and 14th centuries in ways that can be traced through the patronage activities of specific queens and through the literary works that royal patronage made possible, and the territorial connection with Aquitaine that Eleanor's Plantagenet inheritance preserved even after the loss of Normandy and Anjou, even after the progressive reduction of English continental possessions through the 13th and early 14th centuries, remained a defining feature of the English political landscape until the 100 Years' War finally resolved the question of English sovereignty over the southwestern corner of France in France's favour in the 1450s, more than 2.5 centuries after Eleanor's death. The endurance of the Aquitanian connection across this extraordinary span of time was itself, in part, a consequence of the specific diplomatic and legal actions that Eleanor had taken in the final years of her life to protect the duchy from the political consequences of the Angevin inheritance's collapse in the north, and it testifies to the long-term effectiveness of the political intelligence she had brought to the management of her most important territorial asset throughout her career. The legacy of Eleanor of Aquitaine, considered across the full span of its historical consequences from the 12th century to the present day, constitutes a phenomenon whose complexity and whose continuing vitality in scholarship, popular culture, and public discourse resist simple summary but reward sustained analytical attention as an illuminating example of the relationship between individual political agency and structural historical conditions, between personal intelligence and institutional opportunity, and between the specific historical circumstances of a single life and the broader patterns of human political organization that give individual lives their significance. Eleanor's immediate political legacy was territorial and dynastic. The Duchy of Aquitaine, which she brought to the Plantagenet inheritance and which she protected through her own diplomatic action in the final years of her life, remained associated with the English crown for more than 2 centuries after her death, providing the foundation for the English claim to French territory that shaped European politics across the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, and that generated in the 100 Years' War one of the most consequential conflicts in the history of medieval Europe. The children she bore to Henry Richard, whose crusading career made him the most celebrated military figure of the 12th century, Eleanor of Castile, who became the grandmother of Blanche of Castile, Joan of Sicily, whose second marriage to the Count of Toulouse created a connection between the Plantagenet and Provençal political traditions, and John, whose reign produced both the constitutional crisis of Magna Carta and the territorial catastrophe of Normandy's loss. Each carried within their governance and their political choices something of the formation they had received. In Eleanor's orbit, whether at her Poiters court, in the cultural environment of the Angevin Empire she had helped to create, or through the specific relationships with her that had shaped their understanding of what governance required and what political authority demanded. The institutional legacy was embedded in the administrative traditions of both Aquitaine and England, in the legal precedents that Eleanor's specific deployments of canonical and feudal law established, and in the governance models that her courts provided for subsequent generations of ruling women, who found in her example both inspiration and practical guidance for the exercise of political authority within the institutional frameworks available to them. The cultural legacy was the most diffuse but perhaps the most enduring of the three, extending through the vernacular literary traditions that Eleanor's patronage helped to nurture into the entire subsequent development of European literary culture, from the Arthurian romances of the 13th century through the troubadour-influenced lyric poetry of the Italian Dolce Stil Novo that would eventually lead to Petrarch, and through Petrarch to the entire tradition of European love. Poetry. Eleanor of Aquitaine died in April of 1204, having outlived 2 husbands, 4 of her 10 children, and the greater part of the political world that she had helped to create, having exercised across 6 decades of active political life a degree of independent political agency that no other woman of the medieval Latin West matched in its combination of scope, duration, and consequence. She was buried at Fontevraud alongside the husband who had imprisoned her and the son who had liberated her, in the most significant royal burial complex of the Plantagenet world. Attended in her final years by the religious community whose habit she had taken as her preparation for the death that would release her from a life of extraordinary intensity and extraordinary consequence. The question of what made her the most dangerous queen of the Plantagenet era has an answer that the entire arc of her career illuminates with exceptional clarity. She was dangerous because she was intelligent enough to understand precisely what power was available to her within the institutional frameworks of her time, determined enough to pursue it through every legitimate mechanism those frameworks provided, and possessed of the territorial resources, the dynastic connections, and the personal capacities to succeed in that pursuit with a consistency and an effectiveness that no other woman of her period or of the Plantagenet era that she helped to create could match. 8 centuries after her death, the fascination she exercises over historians, writers, dramatists, and general readers testifies to the recognition that some lives illuminate, with exceptional clarity and exceptional force, the permanent possibilities and the permanent constraints of human political existence, and that Eleanor of Aquitaine's life is among the most illuminating of those lives that the entire recorded history of the human political world has produced. The Council of Beaugency convened in March of 1152, bringing together an assembly of bishops and ecclesiastical judges, whose formal task was to adjudicate the consanguinity question that Eleanor and Louis had raised as the canonical grounds for the dissolution of their marriage. The proceedings were brief, the outcome predetermined, and the judgment unanimous. Eleanor and Louis were related within the prohibited degrees of kinship, as the Church defined them. Their marriage was therefore null from its inception, and both parties were free to contract new unions with partners who did not share their degree of blood relationship. The children of the marriage, Marie and Alex, were declared legitimate despite the annulment of their parents' union, since the good faith of the parties at the time of the wedding preserved the children's legal status, even as it erased the canonical validity of the marriage itself. Eleanor left Beaugency as she had entered it, Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, sovereign of territories whose value had not diminished during the 15 years of her French queenship, and whose governance she was now free to manage without the complicating overlay of Capetian administrative preferences. The challenge she faced in the immediate aftermath of the annulment was the same one her father's death had created 15 years earlier. She was a woman of enormous territorial wealth, and therefore a target for precisely the kind of forced marriage that feudal law found difficult to condemn when conducted by those with sufficient military power to enforce their will. Two separate attempts to seize her in the weeks following the annulment, one by Theobald of Blois and one by Geoffrey of Anjou, the younger brother of Henry Fitz-Empress, were frustrated by the speed of her travel and the alert management of her escort, demonstrating that the dangers of her position were not theoretical and that her recognition of those dangers was entirely realistic. What is most significant about Eleanor's conduct in the weeks immediately following the annulment is the speed and the decisiveness with which she moved to resolve her exposed position through the marriage that would define the second and most politically consequential phase of her career. Henry Fitz-Empress, Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, was 11 years Eleanor's junior, a young man of 20 who had already demonstrated in the campaigns he had conducted in England and Normandy the military energy, political intelligence, and administrative capacity that would eventually make him one of the most significant rulers in the history of the English monarchy. The attraction between Eleanor and Henry, whatever its personal dimensions may have been, had a political logic of overwhelming clarity. Henry needed the territorial resources of Aquitaine to complete the dominance over western France that his Angevin and Norman holdings already suggested, and Eleanor needed the military protection and political authority that a husband with Henry's capacity could provide. The marriage was celebrated in Poitiers on the 18th of May in 1152, a ceremony conducted with deliberate informality, given the circumstances, the speed of the arrangement, the sensitivity of conducting a marriage so soon after the annulment of the previous one, and the political implications of uniting Aquitaine with the Angevin and Norman territories without the prior knowledge or consent of Louis VII, whose reaction to his former wife's remarriage to his most powerful territorial rival would almost certainly be hostile. Louis's hostility was indeed immediate and expressed in military terms, but the campaign he launched into Norman territory in the summer of 1152 was conducted without the strategic clarity or the military resources to achieve its objectives, and it ended in a withdrawal that confirmed, rather than challenged, the new political reality that Eleanor's remarriage had created. Within 2 years, the political logic that had made the Aquitanian marriage so advantageous for Henry was reinforced by the most significant single event of his career up to that point: the death of King Stephen of England on the 25th of October in 1154, and Henry's accession to the English throne under the terms of the Treaty of Wallingford, negotiated the previous year, which had recognised Henry as Stephen's heir and successor, bringing to an end the period of civil war known as the Anarchy that had devastated England for nearly 2 decades, and clearing the path for the construction of the Angevin Empire in its full territorial extent. Eleanor became Queen of England at her husband's coronation at Westminster on the 19th of December in 1154, a ceremony that elevated her to the highest formal rank in the English kingdom, and that placed her at the centre of a political enterprise whose ambitions were continental in scope, even as its administrative base was being rebuilt from the programmes. Institutional wreckage of the anarchy years. The England that Eleanor and Henry inherited was a kingdom whose infrastructure of royal governance had been severely disrupted by 2 decades of civil conflict, whose baronial class had developed habits of autonomous military action and self-interested legal interpretation that the new king would need to systematically dismantle, and whose financial resources had been depleted by the continuous warfare of the preceding period in ways that would require both administrative innovation and aggressive extraction to restore. Eleanor's role in the governance of this kingdom was not the passive decorative function that conventional narratives of medieval queenship sometimes imply. The pipe rolls, those extraordinary administrative records of the English exchequer that survive from the reign of Henry II, with a completeness almost unparalleled in the documentation of medieval governance, record Eleanor's exercise of real administrative authority during periods of Henry's absence from England, issuing writs in her own name, approving financial transactions, presiding over legal proceedings, and managing the practical affairs of a kingdom whose governance required continuous attention from someone with both the legal authority and the political intelligence to handle the complex interactions of feudal obligation, ecclesiastical privilege, and royal prerogative that constituted the daily business of Angevin administration. The children that Eleanor bore Henry in the years following their accession to the English throne formed the largest and most politically significant royal family in the Western European world of the second half of the 12th century. Henry, born in the spring of 1155, was the eldest son and the heir presumptive, known to history as the young king, to distinguish him from his father. Richard, born on the 8th of September in 1157 at Oxford, inherited his mother's Aquitanian lands and something of her cultural sensibility, developing into the warrior poet whose crusading career would make him the most celebrated military figure of his generation. Geoffrey, born in 1158, was assigned the Duchy of Brittany through his betrothal to the Breton heiress Constance, adding another major territorial block to the Angevin constellation. 3 daughters followed: Eleanor, born in 1162, who would marry Alfonso, the 8th of Castile; Joanna, born in 1166, who would become Queen of Sicily through her marriage to William II, and the youngest surviving child, John, born at Oxford on the 24th of December in 1166, who would inherit the English throne after both Henry and Richard, and whose reign would produce Magna Carta and the definitive loss of Normandy. The management of this extraordinary family's competing interests, the negotiation of their marriages and their territorial endowments, and the containment of the rivalries between them that Henry's governance strategies inadvertently encouraged, would become the central preoccupation of Eleanor's mature political life, and the arena in which her capacity for independent political agency would find its most dramatic expression. The Beckett conflict that consumed the middle years of Henry's reign, from the appointment of Thomas Becket as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162 to the murder in the cathedral on the 29th of December in 1170, was not merely a dispute between a king and a prelate about the boundaries of royal and ecclesiastical jurisdiction. It was a conflict about the fundamental structure of authority in a kingdom where the institutions of governance were still being assembled, where the relative powers of royal courts and ecclesiastical courts over the population's most sensitive legal affairs were genuinely contested, and where the personal dimensions of a broken friendship between a king and his former chancellor added a layer of emotional intensity to disputes that had sufficient structural weight to generate conflict entirely without personal bitterness to fuel them. Eleanor was not the primary protagonist in the Becket conflict, which absorbed Henry's political energies to a degree that she found at once frustrating and illuminating as evidence of the limitations of a personality that could not separate the personal dimension of a political conflict from its institutional substance. The murder itself, when the 4 knights who had heard Henry's intemperate outburst about the turbulent priest took it as authorization to act, was a catastrophe that reverberating consequences extended far beyond the immediate political crisis, generating a martyrdom cult of extraordinary speed and intensity that transformed Beckett within years of his death into the most popular saint in England and one of the most visited pilgrims' destinations in all of Europe. Henry's penance at Canterbury in 1174, in which he walked barefoot through the city streets and submitted to symbolic flagellation by the monks of the cathedral, was the most dramatic public demonstration of royal guilt and royal submission to ecclesiastical authority in the history of the medieval English monarchy, and it resolved the immediate political crisis while leaving unresolved the underlying institutional tensions that had produced it. The period between approximately 1168 and 1173 represents the years during which Eleanor withdrew from the English court and established herself at Poitiers as the mistress of a cultural and political environment that reflected her own values and priorities with a directness that had never been possible within the constraints of the Angevin court at Henry's side. The court at Poitiers in these years became one of the most celebrated cultural centres in the Western European world, patronising troubadour poets, including Bernard de Ventadorn, whose verses addressed to Eleanor herself survive as documents of the cultural environment she created, and providing the environment within which the Arthurian romances that her daughter Marie would subsequently patronise in the north were first being developed in their mature literary form. The poetry being composed at and for the Poitevin court in these years was not merely decorative entertainment. It was a form of intellectual and political argument, exploring through the elaborated conventions of courtly love poetry the questions about the relationship between personal desire, social obligation, and political authority that were directly relevant to the circumstances of those who composed and consumed it. Chrétien de Troyes, working in the circle of Marie of Champagne, and under the influence of the cultural program that Eleanor had established, was developing the Arthurian romance cycle into its classic form during precisely these years, creating in the figure of Arthur's court an idealized political community whose values, courtesy, loyalty, martial excellence, the protection of the weak, the subordination of personal interest to communal obligation functioned as an implicit commentary on the governance values of the actual courts that read and performed these texts. The Poitevin court's function as a space for the elaboration of these cultural values was inseparable from its function as a political centre, a location from which Eleanor could exercise real governance authority over the Aquitanian duchy, whose administration required a resident presence with genuine authority, and a base from which she could maintain and develop the political relationships with the southern vassal lords whose loyalty was to the Duchy of Aquitaine as a political entity rather than to the Angevin Empire of which it had become a part through her marriage. Henry's governance strategy for the empire he had assembled had, by the late 1160s, created the conditions for a crisis that his own behaviour had made inevitable. He had promised his eldest son's territorial authority and administrative responsibility without providing the real exercise of power that such promises implied, had made commitments about the succession to his various territories that were mutually contradictory in their practical implications, and had managed his relationships with his sons in a way that combined apparent generosity with actual control to a degree that the sons found increasingly intolerable as they grew into political maturity. The Great Rebellion of 1173, in which Henry the young king, Richard, and Geoffrey all took up arms against their father in conjunction with Louis VII of France and a substantial portion of the English and continental baronage, was the direct consequence of this governance failure, and Eleanor was its most significant organiser and most consequential participant. Eleanor's role in organising the rebellion of 1173 has been established by historians working from the limited but suggestive documentary evidence of the period as central rather than peripheral, a conclusion that the scale and coordination of the uprising itself supports, since the simultaneous rebellion in England, Normandy, and Aquitaine that the young kings launched required precisely the kind of organisational intelligence and political network that Eleanor possessed, and her sons, still in their mid-teens and early 20s, did not. Her decision to support the rebellion against her own husband was not an act of political irrationality, but a coherent strategic choice by a woman who had come to recognise that the political framework of the Angevin Empire offered her sons' inadequate scope for the exercise of the authority that their territorial endowments implied, and who calculated that a successful rebellion would produce a restructuring of Angevin governance that would give the young kings real power and correspondingly increase her own political influence as their most important advisor and advocate. The rebellion failed, suppressed by Henry's military energy and political skill, in a campaign that demonstrated, whatever his failures as a husband and father, the formidable effectiveness of his military and administrative capabilities when they were fully mobilized. Eleanor's capture in the autumn of 1173, discovered traveling in male disguise toward the French border in the company of a small escort, was the most immediately consequential outcome of the rebellion's failure for her personally, since it removed her from the political arena for what would prove to be 16 years of captivity under royal supervision at various locations, most notably the castle of Sarum in Wiltshire, where Henry kept her under conditions of comfortable but effective confinement that were designed to prevent her from exercising any further independent political agency without either killing her or generating the canonical and political complications that her death under royal custody would have produced. The 16 years of Eleanor's captivity between 1173 and 1189 were not, for all their externally imposed constraints, years of complete political passivity. The documentary evidence suggests continued engagement with the governance of her own territories through intermediaries, continued maintenance of the political relationships that constituted her network of influence, and continued attention to the political development of her sons, whose careers she followed with the close interest that physical separation could not entirely prevent. The years of captivity were also years in which Eleanor had time for the kind of reflection that active political engagement rarely permits, time to consolidate the understanding of power and governance that her extraordinary career had developed, and time to maintain the personal discipline and political clarity that would make her emergence from captivity in 1189, at approximately 67 years of age, not a diminished epilogue to a career effectively concluded, but the beginning of one of the most extraordinary final acts in the history of medieval political life. Henry II died at Chinon on the 6th of July in 1189, defeated not by external enemies, but by the combined pressure of his own rebellious sons and the relentless military ambition of Philip II of France, dying with the knowledge that Richard had joined forces with the French king against him, and that even his youngest and most favoured son, John, had been found among the conspirators. The deathbed scene at Chinon, as described by the chroniclers who were present or who interviewed witnesses shortly afterwards, has an almost unbearable quality of personal tragedy. A king who had expanded and governed an empire of extraordinary extent and sophistication, dying abandoned by the sons he had failed to trust with real power until it was too late. His death, a direct consequence of the governance failures that his enormous abilities in other areas had obscured but not eliminated. Eleanor, released from her captivity by Richard's immediate orders following Henry's death, travelled with a speed and purposefulness that testified to the completeness with which her political capacities had survived 16 years of confinement, moving through England and the Angevin territories like a force of nature, releasing prisoners, receiving oaths of loyalty, issuing writs, and establishing the administrative foundations for Richard's accession with an efficiency that revealed both the depth of her understanding of royal governance and the extent to which she had been planning for precisely this opportunity during the long years of her captivity. Richard was crowned at Westminster on the 3rd of September in 1189, and Eleanor's role in the ceremonies and the subsequent administration of the kingdom was that of a co-regent in practice, if not in formal title. Her political authority, acknowledged by those around her, with a deference that recognized both her formal position as Queen Mother and the practical reality that Richard's own plans required his mother's management of the kingdom. During the period of his absence on crusade, the preparations for the Third Crusade, which consumed the first year of Richard's reign, were conducted with an administrative efficiency that reflected the capabilities of an Angevin governmental machine now functioning with both Richard's energy and Eleanor's experience simultaneously directing it, generating the financial resources and logistical arrangements for one of the largest crusading expeditions the Western world had yet assembled, while simultaneously managing the complex territorial and dynastic politics of an empire that required continuous attention to prevent its constituent parts from pursuing their separate interests at the expense of its coherence. Eleanor's most extraordinary personal contribution to the preparations for Richard's crusade was her winter journey of 1190 to 1191 across the Alps to the court of the King of Navarre. Undertaken at approximately 69 years of age, with a physical energy and a diplomatic precision that her contemporaries found remarkable, to escort Richard's intended bride, Berenguela of Navarre, northward to meet her husband before he departed for the east. The journey itself, conducted in winter conditions across terrain that would have been formidable for travellers half Eleanor's age, was a demonstration not merely of physical resilience, but of political determination, a recognition that the marriage to Berenguela served important strategic purposes in managing the southern boundaries of the Angevin territories, and that only Eleanor's personal presence could conduct the negotiations and the escort. With the combination of authority and sensitivity that the situation required, she met Richard in Sicily, handed Berenguela over to his custody, and returned to England to manage the kingdom during his absence with a competence and a political dexterity that the administrative record of the period documents with unusual clarity. Richard's capture in December of 1192 by Duke Leopold of Austria, following his shipwreck on the Adriatic coast during the return voyage from the Holy Land, placed Eleanor in a political situation that combined extreme urgency with extreme complexity. The ransom demanded by the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI for Richard's release was 100,000 marks of silver, a sum whose assembly required the mobilization of every available resource of the English kingdom and the Angevin territories, including the levying of a 25% tax on all income and movable property, the seizure of gold and silver plate from monasteries and churches, the commutation of crusading vows to financial contributions, and the collection of feudal aids from every tenant-in-chief of the crown. Eleanor's letter to Pope Celestine III, written during the period of Richard's captivity, is one of the most remarkable documents to survive from the 12th century, and one of the most direct expressions of the political intelligence and emotional intensity that coexisted throughout her career. A letter that combined theological argument, personal anguish, formal legal reasoning, and direct political accusation in a prose of such force and clarity that it represents a literary achievement as well as a political document, deploying every rhetorical resource available to a 12th century letter writer in support of the demand that the Pope intervene to secure Richard's release from captivity that violated every principle of the crusading, immunity that holy warriors were supposed to enjoy. The ransom was assembled, with enormous difficulty and corresponding sacrifice from the English population, and Richard was released at Mainz on the 4th of February in 1194, restored to his mother's custody and to his kingdom in a reunion that must have carried for both of them the weight of everything that the preceding years of separation, captivity, and crisis had contained. Richard's return to England was followed by the rapid suppression of John's rebellion during his brother's captivity, the restoration of royal authority over those who had attempted to take advantage of Richard's absence, and the resumption of the cross-channel military campaigns against Philip of France that had defined Angevin territorial policy for the preceding decade. Eleanor's role in the management of Richard's affairs during the final years of his reign was less publicly visible than it had been during the period of his crusading preparation and his captivity, but no less real in its substance, maintaining the network of political relationships, managing the territorial disputes, and providing the institutional memory that decades of experience at the centre of Angevin governance had given her. Richard died on the 6th of April in 1199 from a crossbow wound received at the siege of the castle of Chalus-Chabrol in the Limousin, leaving the Angevin Empire without the military genius that had been its most effective defensive resource, and opening the succession question that would shape the final decade of Eleanor's life. The succession dispute between John and his nephew Arthur of Brittany, the son of Geoffrey and Constance, who had a rival claim to portions of the Angevin inheritance under the principle of representation that would have made Geoffrey's son the natural heir to those territories that Geoffrey had been expected to receive, was resolved in John's favour in England and Normandy, but not without a period of dangerous uncertainty, in which Eleanor's political activity was once again indispensable to the Angevin cause. Her rapid progress through Aquitaine in the spring of 1199, receiving the homage of her vassals personally and in her own name as Duchess, before the political situation could crystallise around Arthur's competing claim, was a masterpiece of political anticipation and legal precision, securing the loyalty of the southern territories to the Angevin succession by invoking the personal relationship between Eleanor as sovereign duchess and the Aquitanian lords who owed her service, rather than the more tenuous claim of an Angevin king who had yet to consolidate his authority. The journey to Castile in the winter of 1199 to 1200, undertaken at approximately 77 years of age, across the passes of the Pyrenees in winter conditions, to bring her granddaughter Blanche of Castile north for the marriage to Louis, the son of Philip II of France, that the Treaty of Le Goulet required, was the last of Eleanor's great diplomatic journeys, and in some respects the most consequential for the long-term future of the dynasties involved, since Blanche of Castile would become the mother of Louis IX of France, the king known to posterity as Saint Louis, and would herself exercise a political authority as regent of France that made her the most significant female ruler of the 13th century French kingdom. Eleanor retired to Fontevraud, following the completion of this final mission, taking the habit of the religious community there in a gesture of preparation for death that combined genuine devotional intention with the practical convenience of spending her final years in the most prestigious royal burial complex of the Plantagenet world, the community where Henry II and Richard I were already buried, and where she herself had always intended to be laid to rest when the time came. She died in the first week of April in 1204, after a life of approximately 82 years that had encompassed more active political engagement, more direct exercise of power, more dramatic reversals of fortune and recovery from them than any other woman of the medieval Latin West could claim. A life whose trajectory from the cultural courts of Aquitaine through the palaces of Paris and Westminster and Poitiers, through the disasters of the Second Crusade and the years of captivity and the extraordinary final decades of political activity, constituted a kind of summary of everything that the 12th century's political world had contained, and a demonstration of what a woman of sufficient intelligence, determination, and territorial resource could accomplish within it. The tomb effigy at Fontevraud, which shows Eleanor in the posture of reading, holding an open book across her chest, presents an image of the Queen that is in some ways the most accurate single representation of her character. A woman whose relationship to the textual and cultural traditions of her civilization was as central to her identity as her exercise of political authority. A woman for whom the life of the mind and the life of power were not separate concerns, but aspects of a single integrated engagement with the world that she had inhabited, shaped, and at her death left permanently altered. The historical assessment of Eleanor of Aquitaine has itself constituted a kind of intellectual battleground across the 8 centuries since her death, a space in which each generation has projected onto her extraordinary career the anxieties, the aspirations, and the ideological frameworks of its own moment in the ongoing argument about what women can and should accomplish in the exercise of political authority. The medieval sources that provide the primary evidence for her life were overwhelmingly written by men who approached female political agency with a combination of fascination and discomfort, unable to ignore the reality of what Eleanor had accomplished, but equally unable to accommodate it within the normative frameworks that their culture provided for understanding women's proper roles. The hostile chronicle tradition, which developed with particular venom in the decades following the disaster of the Second Crusade and the Great Rebellion of 1173, attributed Eleanor's political independence to sexual misconduct, constructing a narrative of adultery and personal licentiousness that served the ideological purpose of delegitimizing female political agency by reducing it to the expression of disordered desire. The specific accusations that Eleanor had conducted an affair with her uncle Raymond of Poitiers in Antioch, that she had been the mistress of the troubadour Bernard de Ventadorn, that she had engaged in sexual relations with Henry's father, Geoffrey of Anjou, before her marriage to Henry himself, and the most lurid later elaboration that she had participated in erotic relationships with Saladin, who was a teenager in 1148, and who was, in any case, nowhere near the locations where Eleanor was during the Crusade, have no credible evidentiary foundation in the contemporary sources and represent the standard repertoire of sexual slander deployed against politically active women throughout the medieval period. What they reveal is not Eleanor's sexual conduct, but the incapacity of the hostile chronicle tradition to construct a coherent account of female political ambition that did not ultimately reduce it to the operation of erotic motivation. Since the frameworks available to medieval male writers for understanding women's behavior were so thoroughly organized around the categories of sexual virtue and sexual vice, that the exercise of autonomous political intelligence, by part, the woman fell inevitably into the second category by default. The more sympathetic chronicle tradition, which was also present and which received its most sophisticated expression in the accounts written by those who were directly acquainted with Eleanor or with her courts, presents a figure of quite different character, a woman of exceptional intelligence and cultural sophistication, a patron of extraordinary generosity and discriminating taste, a political actor whose methods were consistently more subtle and more effective than the blunter instruments available to male politicians of her era, and a person whose longevity and sustained political engagement across 8 decades of active life gave her an accumulated wisdom and institutional experience that no contemporary could match. The truth of Eleanor's character, insofar as the fragmentary historical evidence permits its reconstruction, lies neither in the hostile tradition's caricature of sexual disorder, nor in the sympathetic tradition's idealization of courtly perfection, but in the complex reality of a person who combined genuine cultural sophistication with relentless political ambition, who could deploy charm and aesthetic sensitivity as instruments of political management while simultaneously pursuing territorial and dynastic objectives with a strategic clarity that belied any reduction of her character to purely personal or aesthetic dimensions. She was, as the historical record documents with cumulative force, a woman who understood power in its institutional dimensions with a precision that matched and, in some respects, exceeded that of the most politically sophisticated men of her era, who deployed the specific instruments available to a woman of her position: territorial sovereignty, dynastic alliance, cultural patronage, the management of ecclesiastical relationships, the exploitation of canonical legal mechanisms, with a consistency and an effectiveness that constituted not merely exceptional individual achievement, but a sustained demonstration of what female political agency could accomplish, within the structural constraints of a political world designed primarily for men. The assessment of her as dangerous, the characterization that the title of this account proposes as its organizing frame, requires some unpacking if it is to serve as a genuine analytical tool rather than a dramatic epithet. Eleanor was dangerous, not in the sense that she was personally violent, though she navigated with considerable equanimity political environments in which physical danger was a constant presence, and not in the sense that she was recklessly destructive of the institutions within which she operated, though she was entirely willing to challenge those institutions when they failed to accommodate her legitimate interests. She was dangerous in the more precise sense that she constituted, throughout her active political career, a genuinely independent centre of political power and political judgment that operated within the Angevin political system but was not fully controlled by it. A centre whose territorial base in Aquitaine gave it economic and legal foundations that could not be dismantled without destroying the territorial coherence of the empire itself, and whose political intelligence was sophisticated enough to identify and exploit the structural vulnerabilities of a system that depended on the cooperation of its most powerful members for its effective operation. Henry II, who was by every measure one of the most able rulers of the medieval period, found Eleanor's independence sufficiently threatening to justify 16 years of captivity, a period of confinement that represents the most extended deployment of royal coercive power against a member of the royal family in the entire Plantagenet era, and that testifies to Henry's recognition that Eleanor at liberty was a political force capable of challenging the structural arrangements on which his imperial governance depended. The fact that Eleanor survived the captivity, retained her political capacities and her territorial authority through it, and emerged from it to play a central role in the politics of Richard's reign and the succession crisis of John's accession, is itself the most eloquent testimony to the resilience of the independent political base that she had constructed and maintained through decades of active political engagement. She was dangerous because she was effective, and she was effective because she combined the territorial resources of the Duchy of Aquitaine with the political intelligence to understand how those resources could be deployed in the pursuit of objectives that she defined for herself, rather than accepting the definition that the men around her preferred. That combination of territorial power and independent political judgment was, in the institutional context of the 12th century Angevin Empire, a genuinely disruptive force, one whose disruptive potential Henry recognized and attempted to neutralize through confinement, and one whose legacy shaped the political development of the Plantagenet dynasty in ways that extended far beyond the specific episodes in which its effects were most dramatically visible. The children she raised, and the political values she transmitted to them, the cultural institutions she patronized, and the literary traditions she helped to nurture, the diplomatic precedents she established, and the governance models she demonstrated through the exercise of her own authority, all of these contributed to the formation of the Plantagenet world that her marriage to Henry had helped to create, and that her political agency across 8 decades had consistently shaped and directed toward ends that she understood as consonant with the interests of the dynasty, even when they conflicted with the preferences of the individual kings who were her husbands and her sons. The story of Eleanor of Aquitaine is, in its deepest dimensions, the story of what power looks like when it is exercised with sustained intelligence and sustained purpose across a life long enough and eventful enough to encompass the full range of what the medieval political world could offer: glory and captivity, love and loss, the management of empires and the endurance of imprisonment, the patronage of the arts and the conduct of war, the raising of children who became kings and queens across the breadth of Europe, and the final retreat into the contemplative life of a religious community chosen with the same combination of political calculation and genuine spiritual intention that had characterized every major decision of an existence remarkable, enough to have fascinated 8 centuries of readers, and to have lost none of its capacity to illuminate the permanent questions of power, agency, and human possibility that its extraordinary arc continues to pose with undiminished force. The physical landscape of Eleanor's world, the particular places where she lived and ruled and suffered and governed, constitutes a kind of material argument about the nature of power and its relationship to the territories through which it is exercised. The palace at Poitiers, where she held her court, the great hall of whose medieval structure survives in sufficient completeness to permit a vivid reconstruction of the ceremonial space in which Aquitanian court culture reached its fullest expression during the years of her independent governance, is a building that speaks to the integration of practical governance and aesthetic ambition that characterized everything Eleanor built or patronized. The walls that she may have commissioned the decoration of, the sculptures that she certainly knew and that shaped her visual culture from childhood, the Romanesque churches that lined the pilgrimage routes through her territories and whose architectural programs she would have absorbed with an educated eye, trained by decades of exposure to the finest material culture of the 12th century West. These physical remains of Eleanor's world are not merely archaeological curiosities, but evidence of a civilization whose sophistication and whose particular understanding of the relationship between beauty and power left marks on the subsequent development of European culture that can be traced with reasonable confidence through the literary traditions she patronized, and the institutional arrangements she helped to establish. The troubadour tradition that had its roots in Eleanor's grandfather's verse, and that reached its fullest development in the courts she patronized at Poitiers and in the network of cultural production that spread from those courts across the whole of the southern French and Iberian cultural world, was not simply an aesthetic phenomenon. It was a political and intellectual tradition that shaped the ways in which educated Europeans of the 12th and 13th centuries understood the relationship between individual feeling and social obligation, between personal desire and institutional constraint, between the authority of established order and the claims of individual experience. The finamore that the troubadours theorized and practiced that complex of attitudes toward desire, restraint, refinement of feeling, and the paradoxical power relations between the desiring subject and the desired object was a cultural technology for exploring the tensions between autonomy and dependence, between the claims of individual consciousness and the demands of social hierarchy that were directly relevant to the political circumstances of everyone who participated in the aristocratic culture of the period. Eleanor's patronage of this tradition was not passive appreciation but active cultivation, a recognition that culture in its most sophisticated forms was also a form of political argument, and that the courts she governed could function as laboratories for the development of values and social models that had implications extending far beyond the immediate pleasures of music and verse. The specific forms that Eleanor's cultural patronage took in the years of her Poitevin court, the commissions to troubadour poets, the hospitality extended to wandering scholars and musicians, the provision of audiences for performances that drew together the social networks of the Aquitanian nobility and the ecclesiastical elite into shared cultural experiences, created the conditions for the emergence of a vernacular, literary culture of extraordinary richness and fertility, one that would produce within 2 generations the Arthurian romance cycle in its mature form. The lyric traditions that Dante and Petrarch would transform into the founding texts of Italian literature, and the philosophical explorations of love and governance that would shape European intellectual life for centuries. The connection between this cultural legacy and Eleanor's political legacy is not coincidental. The woman who could manage the logistics of a crusade, negotiate a royal ransom, organize a rebellion, govern a duchy, and raise the children who would sit on the thrones of England, France, Castile, and Sicily was also the woman who understood that the exercise of power required not merely military force and administrative efficiency, but the cultivation of the cultural environments in which power was legitimated, celebrated, and given the aesthetic forms that made it appear natural rather than arbitrary. The legacy she left was consequently multiple and mutually reinforcing, territorial, dynastic, institutional, and cultural simultaneously, each dimension of her achievement supporting and extending the others in ways that made the whole greater than the sum of its parts, and that ensured that her influence would persist long after the specific political arrangements she had labored to create had been altered or dissolved by the inevitable processes of historical change. Eleanor of Aquitaine remains, 8 centuries after her death at Fontevraud in April of 1204, the most fully documented and the most analytically fascinating woman of the medieval period, the figure whose career provides the most complete and most demanding test of what the historical imagination can recover about the nature of female power and female agency in a world structured primarily to serve and to extend authority of men. Her life was not representative. It was exceptional in almost every dimension, but its exceptionality was not entirely disconnected from the possibilities available to women of her class and period, and the specific ways in which she exceeded those possibilities illuminate with particular clarity the structures that constrained them. She was the most dangerous queen of the Plantagenet era because she understood power completely enough to exercise it independently, persistently, and effectively throughout the 8 extraordinary decades of a life that ended where it had always been heading. In the company of the community of women she had long patronized and admired, with an open book in her hands and the great questions of power and devotion still unresolved, still worth pursuing, still worth the attention of a mind that had never found the world's complexity less than fully engaging. the institutional history of the Plantagenet dynasty that Eleanor helped to found cannot be fully understood without attention to the particular quality of governance that she modelled and transmitted through her children and their courts. The idea of the Queen as a political actor with independent standing and independent judgment, not merely a consort whose function was ceremonial and reproductive, but a participant in the decisions that shaped kingdoms, was not invented by Eleanor, but it was demonstrated by her with a persistence and a persuasiveness that gave it a durability in the Plantagenet context that it had not previously possessed. The queens who followed her in the English royal succession found their positions defined in part by the precedents she had established, the administrative structures she had helped to create, and the cultural expectations she had cultivated in the courts she governed. Her daughter-in-law Berenguela of Navarre, her granddaughter Blanche of Castile, and the subsequent generations of royal women who governed during the minorities, the absences, and the incapacities of their husbands and sons operated in an institutional environment that Eleanor's career had helped to make more hospitable to female governance than it had been before her. This is not to claim that Eleanor eliminated the structural disadvantages that medieval women faced in the exercise of political authority. She did not, and could not, given the depth and the theological legitimation of those disadvantages within the culture of her time. It is to claim that she demonstrated, with a consistency and a force of example, that historical memory could not simply erase, that female political intelligence and female political agency were real capacities rather than theoretical possibilities, and that the institutional frameworks of the medieval state could accommodate the exercise of those capacities when they were brought to bear by individuals with sufficient determination, sufficient territorial resources, and sufficient skill in the deployment of the instruments that those frameworks made available. The specific mechanisms through which Eleanor exercised political authority, the issuance of writs and charters in her own name, the conduct of diplomatic negotiations as a principal rather than a messenger, the management of vassal relationships through personal presence and personal relationship, the deployment of canonical legal argument to achieve political objectives, the use of cultural patronage to construct and maintain political networks, were all mechanisms available in principle to women of her class and position throughout the medieval period. What distinguished Eleanor was not the availability of these mechanisms, but the comprehensiveness, the consistency, and the skill with which she deployed them across a career of 60 or more active political years, creating through that deployment a biographical record of such extraordinary richness that subsequent generations of historians, dramatists, novelists, and filmmakers have returned to it repeatedly in search of illumination about the nature of power, the possibilities of female agency, and the relationship between personal will and structural constraint that constitutes one of the permanent questions of human political existence. The history of Eleanor of Aquitaine is in this sense not merely the biography of a remarkable individual, but a case study in the relationship between personal capacity and institutional context, between the powers that the structures of a given historical moment make available to individuals of different social positions, and the uses that those individuals make of those powers when they possess the intelligence and the determination to exploit them to their fullest extent. Eleanor exploited the possibilities of her historical moment with a completeness that no other woman of the medieval Latin West matched, and the record of that exploitation constitutes one of the most valuable documents the medieval period has transmitted to the present, a demonstration conducted across 8 decades of extraordinary life, of what the combination of territorial power, political intelligence, cultural sophistication, and absolute personal determination could accomplish in the governance of the most complex and most consequential political formation of the 12th century Western world.